I wasn't supposed to hear it. But that one secret changed everything. It started behind a kitchen door, where whispers became warnings. One maid, one secret, one truth powerful enough to destroy a family, or save her soul. They thought no one was listening. But silence always listens back. Sometimes silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. Behind every door there's light. But to find it, you must first walk through the darkness. Behind the kitchen door, where silence speaks louder than fear. The rain had stopped just before sunset, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves and magnolia. Through the tall glass windows of the Moreno residence, the world looked clean again. Glistening driveways, trimmed hedges, and the faint reflection of gold light spilling from chandeliers. Inside, the mansion stood in quiet contrast to the darkening sky. Every corner gleamed with polish, from the marble staircase to the silver-framed family portraits. Behind the kitchen door, however, the air was different, thick with steam, the hiss of running water, and the faint hum of a refrigerator that never seemed to rest. Sadia stood by the sink, her brown hands raw from the day's work, her wrists red from the detergent. She was small, in her late 20s, with tired eyes that had learned to notice everything yet say nothing. Her hijab was pinned tightly, and a long crack ran through one of her nails, a small wound from the kitchen knife she had used to carve meat for the guests that night. It had been a long evening. Senators, businessmen, lawyers, the kind of people who made decisions that shaped cities. They had eaten roasted lamb with rosemary, drank too much wine, and laughed about money as if it were a breeze that followed them everywhere. Sadia had served every plate, quietly refilling their glasses, moving like a shadow among them. Now the guests were gone. Only the echo of their shoes and the ghost of their perfume lingered in the air. Sadia rinsed the last glass and set it on the rack. Her reflection in the steel oven door looked ghostly, a face that had grown older than its years. She heard soft footsteps behind her. It was Eleanor, the other housemaid, a woman in her 50s with a limp and a kind smile. "They gone?" Sadia asked quietly. Elena nodded, drying her hands with a towel. "Yeah, Mrs. Moreno's upstairs. He's still in the study." "Elena." Sadia hesitated. "Did you see how angry she was tonight?" The older woman sighed. "She's always angry, honey. Rich people's sadness comes wrapped in gold." Sadia smiled faintly, but her eyes lingered toward the kitchen door, the one that separated their world from theirs. The voices had started again, at first just murmurs, then sharper. She took a step closer, her heartbeat rising. "You promised me it was over, Daniel." Mrs. Moreno's voice pierced the silence, trembling with rage. "It is," came the man's reply, deep, cold. "You have to trust me." "Trust?" She laughed bitterly. "After everything you've done? After Baltimore?" Sadia stiffened. The word struck her like thunder. "Baltimore," Elena frowned. "What's wrong?" Sadia motioned for silence. "Shh!" She pressed her ear against the wooden panel. The words became clearer. "There was no other choice," Daniel said, his voice sharp, defensive. "You think I wanted it to happen? You think I enjoyed any of it?" "You enjoyed it enough to keep her quiet with money," she spat back. "You said she'd never come back." "You said she was gone." "I said I took care of it." A pause. A dangerous, heavy silence filled the air. Then Mrs. Moreno whispered, trembling, "Daniel, did you kill her?" Sadia's breath hitched. Her knees almost gave out. "No," he said after a moment that felt eternal. "But I should have." The sound of glass shattering followed, maybe a wine glass thrown in anger. Helena flinched. "We shouldn't be listening," she whispered. But Sadia couldn't move. Her life, quiet, invisible, obedient, suddenly felt like it was hanging by a thread connected to that conversation. The girl in Baltimore, whoever she was dead or missing. And the people who paid Sadia's wages, who smiled politely at her and let her serve tea, were hiding something monstrous. The kitchen lights flickered slightly, as if reacting to the tension. The refrigerator hummed louder. Sadia's heart thumped in rhythm with it. Mrs. Moreno's voice returned, lower this time, shaking. "If anyone finds out, if anyone knows what we did, or they won't," Daniel cut her off. "As long as everyone in this house remembers who they work for." Sadia's stomach dropped. The door between them suddenly felt thinner. She could almost feel their eyes through it, though they had no idea she was there. Listening, trembling, her palms pressed against the cool surface of the wood. She backed away slowly, heart pounding. Elena grabbed her arm. "Sadia, don't—" But Sadia's mind was already racing. She had come to America 5 years ago on a work visa, sent by a recruiting agency that promised opportunity and safety. But her passport was locked in a drawer upstairs. For protection, Mrs. Moreno had said. Her pay came late, sometimes cut. She had no papers, no freedom, no one to call. Until now, maybe the secret she had just overheard could finally be her escape. The girl in Baltimore. Whatever had happened to her, whatever the Morenos were hiding, for it was dangerous, yes. But danger was the only kind of power Sadia had ever been close to. She looked at her reflection again, the tired eyes, the trembling hands, and she whispered to herself, "If I'm careful, this could save me." Behind the kitchen door, the clock ticked past midnight. The mansion was silent again, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was the silence before a storm. The next morning, sunlight crept across the marble floor of the Moreno mansion, painting soft golden lines over the Persian rug and the grand staircase. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, Mrs. Moreno's favorite fragrance that she sprayed every morning, like a ritual of control. Outside, the gardener's shears clipped rhythmically through the hedges, but inside there was a tension that couldn't be trimmed away. Sadia stood by the breakfast counter, setting out the morning tray. Coffee pot, sugar bowl, toast, scrambled eggs. Her movements were automatic, but her mind was still trapped behind last night's kitchen door. Every sentence, every whisper, every crash of that wine glass replayed in her head. "You promised me it was over, Daniel. They know about the girl in Baltimore. Did you kill her?" The words tangled inside her like thorns. When she first came to work for the Morenos, she thought she had found refuge, a clean bed, steady meals, safety from the nightmares she'd left behind in Karachi. But now, even in this palace, she could feel the same old fear, the kind that came when you realized how easily the powerful could make the weak disappear. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. The coffee bubbled. Her hands trembled as she poured it into a porcelain cup worth more than her entire month's pay. Elena entered, limping slightly, her apron tied carelessly around her waist. "You're up early," she said. "I couldn't sleep," Sadia replied quietly. Elena frowned. "You still thinking about what you heard?" Sadia nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the black swirl of coffee. "You should forget it, honey," Elena said, lowering her voice. "People like them, they're born knowing how to bury things. You get in their way, they'll bury you too." Sadia looked up. "What if it's about a murder? Shouldn't someone know?" Elena shook her head. "And who'll believe you? You don't even have your papers." That silence hurt more than any slap could. It was the truth, heavy, humiliating and real. Just then, the sound of heels echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Moreno entered, in tall, perfectly dressed, her hair smooth as glass. She didn't glance at Sadia or Elena. She never did in the mornings. "Where's Daniel?" she asked curtly. "In the study, ma'am," Elena said. "Tell him I need him now." Her voice carried command, but her eyes betrayed something else, a sleepless anxiety, the shadow of last night's argument still haunting her. As she turned away, her phone buzzed. She read a message quickly, her lips tightening. Then she murmured to herself, "No name. Just another warning." She left the kitchen before Sadia could move. Elena exhaled. "See, she's scared too," but Sadia barely heard her. Her gaze was fixed on the small folded paper Mrs. Moreno had dropped near the door. A note. She walked toward it, heart pounding. The handwriting was sharp and rushed. "We know about her. Stop covering or we tell the police." Sadia's breath froze. She tucked the paper into her apron just as footsteps approached. Mr. Moreno appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, still in his robe. His presence filled the room like cold wind. He didn't smile. He never smiled at the staff. "Breakfast?" he asked, his tone flat. "Yes, sir," Sadia whispered. She placed the tray before him on the granite island. He didn't thank her. He just sat, opened the newspaper and muttered, "This world is full of vultures." Sadia lingered a moment too long. His voice had the same edge it did last night, that faint tremor of a man hiding something. "Do you need anything else, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone submissive. His eyes lifted to hers and cold blue, assessing. "You were working late last night, weren't you?" "Yes, sir." "How late?" "I cleaned after the guests left." "Did you hear anything you shouldn't have?" The question hit her like ice water. For a second she forgot to breathe. "No, sir," she managed to whisper, lowering her gaze. Just the dishes. He stared at her for a moment longer, then gave a faint, dangerous smile. Good girl. She retreated quickly to the kitchen corner, but her pulse was thundering. He suspects me. The rest of the morning passed in nervous quiet. The house filled with the sound of emails, phone calls, and the television in the background reporting a news story that made Sadia's blood turn cold. Baltimore police are reopening the investigation into the death of 22-year-old Maria Dawson, whose body was found last year in the harbor. The authorities say new evidence may point to powerful figures linked to real estate and political funding. Sadia's hand gripped the counter. The girl in Baltimore. She didn't need to hear more. She turned off the television before anyone could notice her reaction. At noon, she slipped into the laundry room, a narrow space smelling of detergent and steam, and unfolded the note again. We know about her. Stop covering or we tell the police. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but she knew it had been meant for the Morenos. Her hands shook. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. She was just a maid, invisible, unnoticed. But fate had opened a door, and now she stood on the edge of something dark, something she couldn't unsee. She thought of her younger brother back home in Karachi, the one who texted her once a month, asking when she'd return. She had always told him soon, but now soon felt like a lie. Unless she used what she knew, a secret like this could destroy the Morenos. But it could also buy her freedom, her passport, her money, maybe even a ticket home. She looked out through the small laundry room window. In the garden, Mrs. Moreno was on the phone again, pacing nervously. Mr. Moreno stood by the pool, sunglasses on, speaking to someone who looked like a lawyer. They had everything: wealth, respect, power. And yet they looked afraid, and that fear gave Sadia strength. For the first time since she arrived in America, she realized something new. They might have power, but she had something more dangerous, and the truth. The laundry machine beeped. The sound made her flinch. She folded the note again and slipped it into her pocket. Whatever this secret was, murder, money, or betrayal, it had already become part of her life. And as she looked at her trembling reflection in the metal washer door, she whispered, "If they're hiding blood, I'll find where it's buried." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the Virginia sky. The storm hadn't yet reached the mansion, but it was coming. The evening descended slowly over the Moreno estate, wrapping the mansion in a golden twilight that made everything look calm, perfect, untouchable. The lawn sprinklers hissed rhythmically, scattering droplets that sparkled like glass beads under the fading light. From the outside, no one could guess that behind those elegant French windows something was beginning to rot. Sadia stood at the kitchen counter, slicing lemons with quiet precision. Each slice landed with a soft, wet sound on the cutting board, and the rhythm almost drowned out the noise in her head. Almost. Her mind hadn't rested since morning. Every look from Mr. Moreno, every sharp instruction from his wife, every whisper of the word Baltimore inside her skull had become unbearable. It was a sickness she couldn't wash off, and yet she kept working. The Morenos had guests again, this time just two people, an older man in a grey suit and a woman with red lipstick and a heavy accent. They had arrived in the afternoon, stayed in the living room for hours, and now laughter, too loud, too forced, drifted into the kitchen from behind the frosted glass doors. Sadia's instincts told her these weren't ordinary visitors. The man carried a briefcase he never let out of sight. The woman smoked even indoors, her voice thick with confidence and threat. And every time she spoke, Mrs. Moreno's laughter tightened, like someone trying to hide panic behind politeness. Elena, polishing silverware beside her, leaned close and whispered, "That woman's been here before, 2 months ago when you were off on Sunday. Her name's Lydia." Mr. Moreno didn't want Mrs. Moreno to see her back then. Sadia frowned. "You mean?" Elena nodded slowly. Yes, that kind of woman. Sadia felt something click inside her brain, like a missing piece sliding into place. Lydia. The name had been whispered during last night's argument. Case, but if Lydia was the girl from Baltimore, she was very much alive, unless there had been another. The sound of Mrs. Moreno's heels approached. Elena hurried away, leaving Sadia alone with the fruit tray. The kitchen door opened and Mrs. Moreno entered. Her face was flushed not from wine but from something heavier. Fear, maybe rage. "Sadia," she said, voice trembling but sharp. "Bring another bottle of Chardonnay. The good one, from the cellar." "Yes, ma'am," Sadia said softly. As she turned, Mrs. Moreno grabbed her wrist. For a moment, the woman's perfectly painted face softened, not with kindness but desperation. "Sadia, how long have you worked for us?" "Almost 3 years, ma'am. You've seen a lot in this house, yes, and you know when to keep quiet, don't you?" The grip tightened. Sadia could feel the woman's pulse racing under her manicured nails. "Yes, ma'am?" she whispered again. Mrs. Moreno smiled faintly. The kind of smile rich women gave when they wanted to appear in control but were falling apart inside. "Good girl. I like loyal people." She released her hand and walked away, her perfume lingering in the air long after she left. Sadia's heart pounded. The way Mrs. Moreno had asked that question, "You know when to keep quiet, don't you?" wasn't casual. It was a warning, maybe even a threat. Down in the wine cellar, the air was colder. The faint hum of the cooling system filled the silence. Shelves lined with dusty bottles surrounded her, each one tagged with dates and imported origins. Sadia reached for the Chardonnay, but something else caught her eye. A cardboard box shoved behind the lowest shelf. No label. No dust. Recently moved, curiosity overpowered caution. She crouched down, carefully pulled it forward. The box was light, taped shut. With her fingernail, she peeled back the seal and froze. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Receipts, invoices, photos. One photo sat on top. A woman with red lipstick, Lydia, smiling beside Mr. Moreno in what looked like a hotel lobby. His arm was around her waist, her breath caught. Another photo beneath it. Lydia again, this time sitting in a car, her eyes closed. The timestamp on the corner said Baltimore, 2022, and beneath that, a check stub, written out to Lydia Santos, the amount $250,000, memo line, settlement. Sadia's pulse hammered in her ears. Settlement. The girl in Baltimore wasn't just a rumor. She had been paid off. She flipped through more papers. A copy of a non-disclosure agreement typed neatly, signed by Lydia and a law firm in D.C. A clause mentioned incidents involving the Baltimore property. Then a small envelope fell from the stack. It wasn't like the others. This one was handwritten. Inside was a note. "If this ever surfaces, I'll drag you all down with me." No signature. Sadia's hands trembled so hard she nearly dropped everything. She stuffed the papers back quickly, sealed the box and slid it into place. Her breath came shallow and fast. She looked around, half expecting someone to appear behind her, but she was alone. As she climbed the cellar stairs, her mind spiraled. If these papers were what she thought they were, they proved Mr. Moreno's guilt and Mrs. Moreno's silence. But they also gave Sadia leverage. She could go to the police, and if she dared. But how could she, with no papers, no lawyer, no protection? Or she could use them differently. Trade them, bargain, buy her freedom. Back in the kitchen, Elena glanced at her face and frowned. "You look pale." "What happened?" Sadia shook her head. "Nothing. Just cold down there." But her eyes betrayed her. They were alive now, alive with fear, calculation, and something she hadn't felt in years: power. Through the dining room doorway, she saw Mrs. Moreno and Lydia again, both laughing too loudly. Their eyes locked like predators sizing each other up. Mr. Moreno stood apart, phone to his ear, whispering urgently to someone. Sadia noticed how his hand trembled as he spoke, how his eyes darted toward the window as if checking for watchers. Something big was unraveling, and she was now caught right in the center. When dinner ended and the guests finally left, the house sank into silence once more. Sadia cleaned up quietly, her hands moving faster than her thoughts. But inside her chest, something dark and steady was forming, a decision she hadn't fully dared to name. That night, when the rest of the house slept, she went back down to the cellar. This time she brought her phone. Her thumb hovered over the camera icon as she whispered to herself, "If I can't have justice, I'll have proof." She took pictures, every document, every check, every photo, until her battery flashed red. Then she slipped her phone under her pillow, heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. Outside, lightning cracked across the Virginia sky, illuminating the mansion for a brief, blinding second. The house of secrets, gleaming like a lie about to collapse, and in that flash behind the kitchen door, the maid who once cleaned their messes had just become the one holding their fate. The night bled slowly into dawn, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and grey. A thin mist hung over the Moreno estate, softening the sharp lines of wealth and architecture, turning the white stone mansion into a ghost of itself. Somewhere, inside, the rhythm of an expensive life was already beginning. The automatic coffee machine grinding beans, the sprinkler hissing in the garden, the housekeeper's cart rolling down the hall. But Sadia was already awake. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, her heart heavy with exhaustion and adrenaline. Her phone lay on her lap, the photos from the night before glowing faintly on the cracked screen. Documents, signatures, the check to Lydia, the threat letter, proof that her employers weren't who they appeared to be. Her fingers hovered over the send button. She could email the photos anonymously, to the police, a journalist, anyone. She could walk away from this house forever, but she didn't, because fear had a way of freezing even the strongest will. If she sent it, and they traced it back to her, she'd be deported, or worse. And if she stayed silent, she would keep living like this, invisible, obedient, watching evil dine from crystal plates while she scrubbed the stains away. Her chest tightened. What kind of life is that? A soft knock at the door startled her. She quickly locked her phone and hid it under her blanket. "Come in," she said, forcing her voice steady. It was Eleanor. The older woman stepped in quietly, closing the door behind her. She looked nervous, her face pale, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. "Something's not right, Sadia," she whispered. "I just heard them fighting again." "Loud this time," Sadia frowned. "About what?" "I don't know." "But Mrs. Moreno said something like, 'If she talks, we're finished.' Then I heard a crash, like a vase or something breaking." Sadia's stomach sank. "She? You think she means Lydia?" Elena hesitated. "I don't know, but that woman from last night, she's dead." "What?" Sadia's voice came out as a gasp. Elena nodded slowly. "I just heard it on the news downstairs. A woman named Lydia Santos was found in a hotel parking lot this morning. Gunshot wound. Baltimore police say it looks like a suicide, but the reporters don't sound sure." The room spun. Sadia's breath came in short, panicked bursts. Dead. Lydia was dead. The same woman who had laughed in this house just hours ago. It couldn't be coincidence, not after the threats, not after the files. "Do you think—" Elena began. "Yes," Sadia said before she could stop herself. "I think they killed her." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Only the faint sound of a mourning dove outside filled the silence. Elena finally said, "You need to be careful. If they find out you know something—" Sadia nodded numbly. She didn't need the warning. She already knew she was walking a line thinner than thread. Later that morning, Mr. Moreno called her to the study. The room always made her uneasy. Everything about it screamed authority. The mahogany desk, the shelves lined with legal books, the faint smell of cigar smoke. A wall of glass looked out over the manicured garden, where roses bloomed in unnatural perfection. He was standing by the window, phone in hand, his posture too still. "Close the door, Sadia," he said without turning. Her pulse quickened. "Yes, sir." He finally turned to face her. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his expression was calm, the kind of calm that hides fire. "How long have you been with us?" 3 years, sir. You've always been loyal, discreet." "Yes, sir." He studied her face for a long moment, his eyes sharp as blades. "I want to believe that's still true." Sadia's throat went dry. "Of course, sir." He took a slow step closer. "You see, someone broke into my wine cellar last night." Her heart froze. The lock was tampered with. Nothing stolen, but someone touched things they shouldn't have. Sadia swallowed hard. "Maybe it was the delivery man?" Mr. Moreno smiled faintly, not kindly. "No delivery man comes at midnight." He moved around her in a slow circle, like a predator testing his prey. "You work late, you go downstairs, maybe you dropped something, a phone perhaps." Her fingers twitched at her sides. "I didn't, sir," she said quietly. He stopped in front of her. "Look at me." She obeyed. Their eyes met. His were calm, deliberate, but behind them was something dangerous, almost feral. If I ever find out that anyone in this house is listening where they shouldn't, or touching things that don't belong to them. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They won't be here the next morning, do you understand? Sadia nodded slowly, forcing herself not to tremble. Yes, sir. He smiled again, satisfied, and turned back to his desk. Good. You can go. She walked out slowly, every step measured, her lungs burning with held breath. When she finally reached the kitchen, she pressed her hands against the counter, gasping silently. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Elena rushed in a few moments later. What did he say? Sadia shook her head, still trembling. He suspects me. Elena grabbed her shoulders. Then you have to leave tonight, before they do something to you. Sadia looked at her, eyes wide. Leave? Go where? My passport's locked upstairs. I don't even exist here without it. Then take it, Elena said firmly. You're smart. You've been through worse than this. Her words were kind, but Sadia's mind was a storm. She had been through worse. Hunger, betrayal, nights in refugee shelters where she'd learned that silence was safer than truth. But now silence was a prison. She made her choice. That evening, when the Morenos went out, a charity dinner they hosted every year at the mayor's mansion, Sadia climbed the stairs. Each creak of the wooden steps sounded like a confession. Her heart pounded in her ears. She reached the master bedroom, vast, sterile, scented faintly of roses and bleach. The drawer where her passport was kept was locked, but Sadia had cleaned this room for years. She knew every hiding place. The spare key was taped beneath the vanity drawer. Her hands shook as she unlocked it. Inside, beneath stacks of jewelry boxes, lay her small blue passport. She clutched it tightly, the first real piece of freedom she'd touched in years. But as she was about to close the drawer, she saw something else. A black flash drive marked only with a silver sticker. Baltimore footage. Her heart stopped. Without thinking, she pocketed it. As she turned to leave, headlights flashed through the window. The sound of tires on gravel. They were back early. Panic surged. She bolted from the room, down the hallway, her footsteps light but frantic. Halfway down the stairs, she heard the front door open. Mr. Moreno's voice, low and angry. Someone's been in here again, he growled. I can feel it. Sadia darted into the servants' corridor, pressing herself against the wall, her breath shallow. Mrs. Moreno's heels clicked across the floor. Daniel, you're imagining things. No, he snapped. I'm not. We need to check everything. Sadia slipped down the back staircase, heart hammering. The flash drive burned like fire in her pocket. When she finally reached her small room, she locked the door, shut off the light, and collapsed onto the floor. Her fingers trembled as she plugged the flash drive into her old phone, using an adapter Elena had once given her. The screen flickered. A single video file appeared. Baltimore footage, Deck 12.mp4. She pressed play. The video began shaky, filmed from what looked like a hotel surveillance camera. A hallway. Mr. Moreno entering a room, Lydia following behind him. Then, 15 minutes later, the door opening again. Only him walking out. Sadia covered her mouth in horror. The footage cut abruptly. The final frame was time-stamped 11:48 p.m. Her vision blurred with tears. It wasn't just an affair, it was a cover-up. A woman silenced, paid off, and now dead. She sat in the dark, the video still playing silently, her own reflection trembling on the cracked screen. Outside, thunder rumbled again, deep and distant, a warning from the heavens. Sadia whispered to herself, voice shaking but certain, they killed her, and they think they can bury me too. But I won't disappear. The maid who once whispered behind kitchen doors now held the evidence that could bring down the house that had enslaved her. And as the storm gathered over Virginia, the walls of the Moreno mansion seemed to shiver, as if they too knew that their secrets would not stay buried much longer. The rain began just after midnight, not the soft drizzle that kissed windows gently, but a heavy, violent downpour that battered the roof and rattled every pane of glass in the Moreno mansion. Lightning flashed like camera bulbs across the sky, and thunder rolled over the Virginia hills with a slow, ominous weight. The world outside looked like it was trembling, and inside so was Sadia. She sat at her small desk, the glow from her phone screen lighting her face. The flash drive still hung from the side of the device, like a key to some dark, forbidden door. The video had stopped hours ago, but she couldn't make herself look away from the frozen frame. Mr. Moreno leaving that hotel room alone. Lydia never walking out. The image haunted her. Her mind replayed every detail she'd seen in that footage, the reflection of a clock in the hallway, the faint mark on his sleeve, the way his hand brushed his face nervously before he exited. That kind of body language wasn't guilt from infidelity. It was fear, the kind that comes when you've crossed a line you can never uncross. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. He killed her. Not directly, maybe. But somehow he'd made sure she'd never speak again. Sadia leaned back, pressing her palms over her eyes. The air in her room was damp and thick, with the smell of rain seeping through the old window frame. Her reflection in the glass looked like that of a stranger. Tired, frightened, but alive with a kind of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She could expose him. She could take the flash drive, the photos, the note, everything, and go to the police. It would ruin him. Maybe even her too. But if she stayed silent, Lydia's death would be just another secret buried under marble floors. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, faint footsteps on the corridor outside. She froze. Her heart jumped into her throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Not Elena's. Elena's limp made her footsteps uneven. This was someone else. Sadia quickly unplugged the flash drive and slipped it under her mattress. The doorknob rattled once. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silence. Then the sound of the door handle being tried again, gently this time, as if whoever was outside wanted to be sure she was awake. Her pulse hammered. She stood, moving silently to the light switch, turning it off. Darkness swallowed the room. She held her breath and waited. A shadow passed under the door. The footsteps paused. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they moved away. She stood still for several minutes, counting her own breaths. Then slowly she approached the door and pressed her ear against it. The corridor was silent again, except for the distant echo of thunder. When she finally turned the light back on, her hands were shaking. She sank into her chair again and whispered to herself, "They're watching me." The next morning the mansion felt different, tighter, more alert. Mrs. Moreno's voice echoed through the halls like sharp glass, snapping at everyone for no reason. Even the gardener was scolded for the angle of his pruning. Elena noticed it too. "They're scared," she murmured to Sadia, while folding linens in the laundry room. "That woman's death. It's all over the news. The police are looking into it. You can see it in their faces." Sadia nodded quietly. "They know something's coming." She didn't mention the flash drive. She couldn't. The less Elena knew, the safer she'd be. By mid-morning, 2 black cars pulled into the driveway. Men in suits stepped out. Not police, not reporters, but the kind of men who spoke quietly and never smiled. They stayed for over an hour, locked inside the study with Mr. Moreno. When they left, their faces were grim, and Mr. Moreno's was worse. After they were gone, Mrs. Moreno came into the kitchen, her expression brittle. "Sadia, coffee," she said curtly. Sadia nodded and moved toward the counter, but her hands weren't steady. She could feel Mrs. Moreno's eyes on her, cold and searching. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" she asked softly. Mrs. Moreno didn't answer right away. Instead, she said, "You've been with us a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am. You're loyal." "I try to be." Mrs. Moreno leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Do you know what happens to people who get curious in this house?" Sadia looked up, meeting her gaze, something she rarely dared to do. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. Mrs. Moreno smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed dead. "They stop working here permanently." The words hung in the air like smoke. Then she took the coffee, turned and walked away. Sadia stood motionless, her knuckles white around the counter's edge. The faint clatter of the spoon against the cup was the only sound in the world for a moment. She had to act soon. That night, the storm returned, louder, heavier. The power flickered twice, plunging the mansion into near darkness. From her window, Sadia could see the lights of police cars far down the road. The news said detectives were expanding their investigation into Lydia's death. She sat on the bed with her phone again, scrolling through the saved photos, her thumb trembling over the send icon. She'd drafted an anonymous email to a Baltimore reporter named Rachel Hunt, whose stories she'd seen online before. The subject line read, "Evidence of political cover-up, Lydia Santos." Her heart pounded as she attached the video screenshots, but before she could press send, there was another knock on her door. Firm this time, urgent. She jumped. "Who is it?" She called, trying to sound calm. "It's me," came Elena's voice, but it was trembling. Sadia opened the door a crack, then froze. Elena's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Sadia whispered. Elena clutched her hand. "You need to get out of here now, they know." "What do you mean?" "They found your prints on the drawer in their room." Mr. Moreno's furious. "He thinks you took something." Sadia's stomach turned. "He'll come here. He's already looking for you. Do you have maybe 10 minutes? Panic rose like a flood inside her chest. She grabbed her small bag from under the bed, shoved the flash drive inside and threw on her coat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely zip it. "Eleanor," she whispered, "come with me." The older woman shook her head. "I can't, they'd know." "But go before it's too late." A sudden shout echoed from downstairs, Mr. Moreno's voice furious. "Sadia, where is she?" Eleanor pushed her toward the back corridor. "Go." Sadia ran. The thunder outside roared as she darted through the servants' hall, her shoes slipping on the polished floor. Behind her, footsteps thundered up the main stairs. Mr. Moreno was calling her name now, voice sharp and full of rage. She burst through the back door into the rain. The cold water hit her face like knives. She stumbled across the yard, toward the small gate near the tool shed, the one that led to the narrow service road behind the estate. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, she saw him through the rain, Mr. Moreno standing at the glass doors, watching her flee. Then he shouted something she couldn't hear over the storm. Sadia forced the latch on the gate open and ran into the night, her breath ragged, her heart a drum in her chest. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, her legs were numb and her clothes soaked. She collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. The screen was wet, flickering, but it still worked. The draft email was still open. She pressed send. For a second, nothing happened. Then, message sent. The signal bar flickered. She whispered a prayer of relief, but before she could move again, headlights appeared at the far end of the road, bright, fast, cutting through the rain like blades. A black SUV, her heart seized. She ducked lower behind the tree, clutching her bag tightly. The car slowed. Its engine hummed softly, waiting. Then the beam of a flashlight swept across the wet road, left, right, closer. Sadia's breath came in silent gasps. Her teeth chattered, more from fear than cold. The flashlight beam passed just a few feet from her. She could see the silhouette of a man in a dark coat, Mr. Moreno's security guard. He scanned the roadside, muttering something into a radio. Then, after a long moment, he turned back toward the car. "Nothing," he said. The SUV doors shut. The engine roared again, and then they drove off into the storm. Sadia waited. 10 minutes, 20. Only when the headlights were gone did she move. She stood shivering, mud clinging to her feet. Somewhere deep inside, terror and determination battled like two wild animals. She had escaped the house. She had sent the truth, but she wasn't safe yet. She whispered into the rain, "You buried one girl in Baltimore. You won't bury me." Then she walked toward the distant highway lights, one small figure against the storm, carrying the secret that could burn an empire. And behind her, in the darkness of the estate, the Moreno's lights flickered again, as if even the house itself had started to realize that its walls could no longer keep their sins inside. The next morning dawned gray and windless, the storm having left behind a sky the color of cold steel. The world outside the Moreno estate was hushed. Wet leaves plastered the pavement, and the air smelled of soil and ozone. In a small bus station 15 miles away, the first bus to Washington, D.C. idled at the curb, its exhaust curling into the chill air. Sadia sat inside, huddled in the back row, her soaked clothes replaced by a clean pair of jeans and a borrowed sweater from a thrift bin she'd found behind a gas station. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw headlights, rain, and Mr. Moreno's shadow framed in lightning at the glass doors. The bag on her lap felt heavier than it should. Inside it were the two things that still mattered, her passport and the flash drive. The bus shuddered as it started moving. She stared out the window as the Virginia countryside slid past. Fields blurred with fog, clusters of houses half buried in autumn leaves, the endless grey ribbon of road leading north. Her phone buzzed weakly. The battery was down to 9%. A single email notification blinked on the screen. Rachel Hunt, re-evidence of political cover-up, Lydia Santos. Her throat tightened. She tapped it open. From Rachel Hunt to anonymous sender. Time 6:04. I don't know who you are, but this footage looks real. If what you're saying is true, it's huge. I'm in Baltimore. Please meet me in person so we can verify. I can protect your identity. Noon, East Harbor Cafe. Don't talk to anyone before that. Sadia exhaled shakily. Noon. That was 5 hours away. 5 hours to survive, to reach the cafe, to trust a stranger. She looked up. A man 2 seats ahead was watching her in the mirror. He turned away when she met his gaze. Paranoia tightened around her like a rope. They could be looking for me already. Her mind went back to the night before. The guard with the flashlight, the SUV's engine growling like a predator in the rain. She knew the Morenos wouldn't just sit and wait. They had money, influence, people. Losing everything wasn't an option for them. By the time the bus reached the edge of the city, sunlight had broken weakly through the clouds. Baltimore rose in front of her, towers of glass, the shimmer of water along the harbor, gulls circling over fishing boats. She got off near a busy intersection and ducked into a small convenience store. The warmth hit her like a blanket. She bought a cup of coffee and a cheap prepaid SIM card, keeping her head low. On the television behind the counter, the morning news was running. Lydia Santos, age 31, found dead outside the Harbor Crown Hotel early this morning. Police sources say the case may be connected to a series of financial investigations involving state contracts and lobbying networks. Sadia's stomach twisted. The image on the screen was one she had seen before. The same red lipstick smile, the same confidence. Only now the photo bore the cold weight of tragedy. The clerk's voice broke her trance. "You okay, miss?" She forced a nod. "Yes, just tired." Outside, the city's heartbeat was louder than she remembered. Car horns, vendors shouting, the rattle of train lines. It felt alive, chaotic, safe in its anonymity. But every time she passed a black car, her pulse jumped. At 11:48 a.m., she reached East Harbor Cafe. It was small, tucked between a bookstore and a florist, the kind of place where people whispered over laptops. The smell of espresso and cinnamon filled the air. Sadia chose a seat in the back corner, facing the door. She could see every entrance, every reflection in the glass. At 12:03 p.m., a woman walked in, mid-30s, sharp grey coat, short blonde hair. She carried no purse, only a notebook. She scanned the room, spotted Sadia and approached with quiet confidence. "You're the one who sent the footage?" she asked softly. Sadia nodded, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Are you Rachel Hunt?" The woman smiled faintly. "Yes, don't worry, we're safe here. I do this a lot." She sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rachel slid a recorder onto the table. "Tell me everything from the beginning." And so, for the first time, Sadia told her story, from the first whispers behind the kitchen door, to the discovery of the documents, to the night she ran through the rain. Her voice shook at first, but the more she spoke, the clearer it became. When she finished, Rachel leaned back, eyes wide. "You realize what this means? The Morenos are connected to Senator Dalton's real estate network. This could tear open half the legislature." Sadia swallowed. "I don't want trouble. I just want to be free." "You will be," Rachel said gently. "But you can't go back. Not even to collect your things. They'll be watching the house, maybe the stations too." Rachel took the flash drive, plugged it into her laptop and watched the footage silently. The hum of the cafe seemed to fade. When the video ended, she whispered, "God, they really did it." Then she looked up. "We'll protect you. I'll get this to a federal contact I trust. You'll stay somewhere safe until they act." Sadia's relief was fragile but real. "You promise?" Rachel nodded. "You have my word." They left the cafe together through the back alley. Rain had started again, light but steady. That night, Sadia stayed in a small apartment Rachel arranged, one room, a sofa, and a view of the harbor. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. She made herself instant noodles and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker across the water. Her phone buzzed with another message from Rachel. They're moving fast. A warrant for the Morenos may come tomorrow. Don't go outside. I'll come by in the morning. Sadia smiled weakly and whispered, Alhamdulillah, under her breath. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and closed her eyes. But even in that small moment of calm, the sound of thunder returned in her memory, the echo of boots on marble floors, the creak of the door handle in the night. Hours later, she woke suddenly to a soft noise, a click, faint but unmistakable like a lock turning. Her pulse spiked. She sat up, listening. Another sound followed, the quiet shift of footsteps outside her door. Sadia's mouth went dry. She reached for her phone, but the battery had died. Then 3 soft knocks. She froze. Who's there? She whispered. No answer. She backed away slowly toward the small kitchen. Her eyes darted to the counter where a paring knife lay beside the sink. Another knock. Louder. Miss Sadia, came a male voice, calm, measured, too polite. We just want to talk. Her breath hitched. That accent, that tone, she knew it. Mr. Moreno's security guard. She gripped the knife tighter. Go away! We can make this easy, he said through the door. You don't understand what you're part of. She looked around desperately. The apartment had no back exit, only a small window that opened onto the fire escape. She grabbed her bag, stuffed the passport inside and ran to it. The door burst open behind her. A man stepped in, tall, wearing black gloves. Sadia screamed and climbed out onto the fire escape as rain began to fall harder. Her bare feet slipped on the wet metal, but she kept going, down one level, then another. Stop! The man shouted, chasing after her. She didn't stop. By the time she reached the street, people were already staring, startled by the commotion. The guard hesitated at the top of the fire escape, too exposed to follow. Sadia darted into the crowded street, disappearing among umbrellas and traffic. Her lungs burned. She didn't know where she was running, only that she had to keep moving. She turned a corner and ducked into a narrow alley, pressing her back against the wall, panting. Across the street, she saw flashing blue lights, police cars. For a second, she thought it was over. Then she saw Rachel standing beside the officers, talking urgently, holding up the flash drive. When she spotted Sadia, she waved her over. Sadia stumbled forward, tears mixing with rain. Rachel caught her in an embrace. You're safe now, she whispered. They can't touch you anymore. The officers surrounded them, guiding Sadia toward a patrol car. Behind them, more cars sped past, heading toward the Moreno's mansion. The news that would break the next day would stun the entire state. Senator Dalton, Daniel Moreno, and several others arrested on charges of obstruction, bribery and homicide. Weeks later, in a quiet suburb of Maryland, Sadia sat in a small apartment with new papers, a new name, and a cup of hot tea warming her hands. Outside, snow fell lightly. She still dreamed of the kitchen door sometimes. The voices, the whispers, the moment her old life cracked open to reveal the truth. But she no longer woke in fear. She had crossed the line from silence into witness, from invisible servant to the woman who had torn open an empire's lie. And as she looked out at the falling snow, she murmured, behind every door there's a story, but some stories refuse to stay buried. The storm had passed, but its echo, the truth she'd carried, would live forever. The winter that followed changed everything. By January, snow blanketed Maryland, covering every roof and treetop with a silence that felt deeper than peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when the world is still trying to remember how to breathe. Sadia stood by the window of her small apartment, watching the flakes drift down like ashes from heaven. The world outside looked clean, untouched, but she knew that purity was an illusion. The past could never truly melt away. It only buried itself under new layers of time. She had been given a new identity by federal protection, Sarah Malik, 30 years old, from Karachi. The papers said she was a translator for a non-profit. The truth was stranger. She was the ghost of a scandal that had shaken Washington to its core. When the story broke, it hit every major network. Rachel's article came first. The Baltimore Connection, Murder, Money, and the Hidden Life of Senator Dalton. It went viral within hours. Reporters flooded the Moreno estate. Cameras flashed through the iron gates. Within days, Daniel Moreno was arrested for obstruction and perjury. Investigators unearthed a trail of forged documents, illegal payouts, and offshore accounts that linked him directly to Dalton's campaign funds, and indirectly to Lydia's death. Mrs. Moreno disappeared 2 nights before the warrant arrived. Her credit card stopped working. Her phone went dark. The FBI suspected she'd fled abroad, perhaps to Spain or Morocco. Her face was everywhere for weeks, on television screens, online headlines, even on the most wanted posters taped inside train stations. But despite all that noise, Sadia, or Sarah now, was invisible. The government had tucked her away under a witness protection program. She had no contact with anyone from her old life, not even Elena. She didn't know if Elena had kept her job or if the Moreno's downfall had dragged the rest of the staff into chaos. Sometimes she dreamed of the older woman's voice calling her name, the way it trembled with both fear and love that last night. Rachel was the only person allowed to visit. Every 2 weeks she would drive up from Baltimore, bringing groceries, news, and quiet conversation. She had become the only familiar piece of Sadia's new world, a fragile link to the life she'd barely survived. This morning, Rachel sat across from her at the small dining table, flipping through her notes. "The trial starts next month," she said. "They want you to testify via closed-circuit video. No names, no face shown, just your voice." Sadia stirred her tea slowly. "He'll hear me, though." Rachel nodded. "Yes, but he won't see you. He won't know where you are." Sadia looked out the window again. "He doesn't need to see me." "He'll remember my voice," the journalist smiled faintly. "I think he already does." They sat in silence for a moment. The heater hummed softly. Then Rachel said, "You know people are calling you the maid who broke Washington. You changed the course of a senator's career, a political dynasty. You gave a dead woman justice." Sadia's eyes softened. "Lydia," she whispered. She was more than a headline. She was a warning. "A mirror." Rachel leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Sadia looked at her hands, small, scarred, still rough from years of scrubbing marble floors. She was trapped too. Different cage, same bars, power, silence, fear. "I just didn't want to die without breaking mine." Rachel's voice was gentle. "You did more than that, Sarah. You broke theirs." That night after Rachel left, Sadia couldn't sleep. The snow outside had stopped, but the wind still whispered through the cracks of the old building. She sat at her desk with a small lamp, her notebook open. Since the trial began, she had started writing. At first, short notes to steady her mind, then longer entries that grew into something else entirely. Her story. On the first page, in her careful English handwriting, she had written, "Behind the kitchen door, the truth doesn't whisper. It waits." She wrote about her first day in America, about how she had believed kindness was the language of every home. She wrote about the nights she cooked for the Morenos, the way wealth could hide cruelty behind soft voices and expensive perfume. She described the smell of that wine cellar, the cold terror of hearing her name on Mr. Moreno's tongue. But she didn't write with hatred. She wrote with distance, like someone standing on the far shore of her own life, watching the wreckage drift away. Sometimes she cried quietly as she wrote, not for herself, but for all the invisible people she had met along the way, the women who cleaned offices after midnight, the ones who sent money back home, who hid bruises under sleeves, who whispered Inshallah before sleeping, because faith was all they had left. Weeks passed. January became February. The trial began in Washington, under heavy security. Sadia's testimony, though recorded off-site, became the turning point. Her voice, steady, calm, unbroken, was played before the courtroom. "I saw the papers," she said. "I saw the payments. I saw the footage that proved what they did. I may not understand politics, but I understand fear. And the people in that house were afraid of the truth." Mr. Moreno sat silent throughout the testimony, his expression unreadable. But according to Rachel, the moment Sadia's voice echoed in that courtroom, his fingers began to tremble. By March, he was convicted on multiple counts: conspiracy, obstruction, destruction of evidence. He would spend 25 years in prison. Dalton resigned from the Senate. The networks moved on to other scandals, other headlines. For most people, the story ended there. But for Sadia, it was only beginning. Spring came quietly to Maryland. The snow melted into soft rivers. The first flowers began to bloom in the park behind her apartment. She had started volunteering at a women's shelter under her new name. The work was simple: helping other immigrant women fill out job applications, translating forms, sometimes just sitting with them when they cried. They didn't know her story. She didn't tell them. She just listened. One afternoon, a young woman named Layla, newly arrived from Morocco, asked her, "Miss Sarah, why do you always listen so much and speak so little?" Sadia smiled. "Because for a long time, no one listened to me. Now I make sure someone listens to them." Layla tilted her head. "You sound like someone who's been through a war." Sadia paused. "In a way, I have." When the day ended, she walked home through the park. The sky was pink and gold, the kind of color that made even sorrow look tender. Children played with kites on the grass, their laughter rising into the breeze. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider watching someone else's life. She felt, if only faintly, part of the world again. That night, Rachel called. "You'll want to see the news," she said. Sadia turned on the TV. The screen showed a grainy image, Mrs. Moreno arrested in Tangier, Morocco, while attempting to board a private yacht. She looked older, thinner, her hair streaked with grey. The reporter's voice said she had been extradited to the US on charges of aiding a cover-up. Sadia stared for a long time. She didn't feel triumph, only a strange, quiet sadness. "She's finished," Rachel said over the phone. "They all are." Sadia nodded slowly. "Maybe now Lydia can rest," Rachel hesitated. "And you?" "I'm learning to live." Weeks later, a package arrived at her door with no return address. Inside was a copy of a hardcover book, its title embossed in gold letters, The Baltimore Connection. Rachel's book. Inside the front cover, a handwritten note. For Sarah Malik, whose courage began this story, and whose silence broke an empire. Sadia held the book against her chest for a long time, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Then she placed it on the shelf beside her Quran. That night she opened her notebook again. "People think courage is loud," she wrote. "But sometimes it's the quietest thing in the world. The sound of a woman whispering no behind a kitchen door, and meaning it." She looked out at the moon hanging over the quiet harbor, its light spilling across the still water, and for the first time in her life, Sadia smiled without fear. She had no riches, no fame, no promises of forever. But she had truth, and truth, she had learned, was the one thing that could never be bought. Buried or silenced, outside the world kept turning, new scandals, new elections, new names in the news. But in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, a woman who once lived as a shadow now lived as light, and sometimes, when she passed a kitchen door and heard laughter on the other side, she would pause, listen for a moment, then smile because she knew better than anyone. Behind every door, there is a secret, but behind some secrets there is freedom. The spring sunlight spilled gently through the thin white curtains of Sadia's new apartment, touching the modest furniture and wooden floor with a kind of quiet warmth that felt almost like forgiveness. Outside, cherry trees bloomed along the narrow street, scattering pink petals that drifted through the air like soft whispers of renewal. It had been almost a year since the night she ran through the rain with the flash drive that changed everything. In that time, her name, her home, and even her identity had transformed. But one thing had not: the memory of the voices behind that kitchen door. Sometimes, in her dreams, she still heard Mrs. Moreno's cold whisper, "You know when to keep quiet, don't you?" and woke with her hand clutching the blanket like a lifeline. But the fear no longer stayed with her in the daylight. It faded under the soft rhythm of a new routine. Her mornings began with prayer. She would spread her small prayer mat beside the window, facing east, and whisper Alhamdulillah, a thankfulness that had deepened, not just for survival, but for the strange grace that had led her from terror to freedom. After that, she'd step outside with her notebook, walking slowly to the park 2 blocks away. The park had become her sanctuary, children playing, mothers talking in foreign languages, old men feeding pigeons. No one knew who she really was. And that anonymity, which had once felt like erasure, now felt like peace. Rachel's book had turned her story into something larger than either of them imagined. It had become a bestseller, taught in universities as an exposé on corruption and abuse of power. Politicians cited it in speeches, activists quoted it in rallies. And while Rachel's name was everywhere, Sadia's was nowhere, by her own choice. When Rachel came to visit now, she always asked the same question: "Are you sure you don't want your name to be known?" And Sadia always gave the same answer, softly but firmly. My name is not the story. The truth is, Rachel understood, though she often sighed, you could help so many women, Sarah. I already do, Sadia would say, with a small smile, because every week in that same park, Sadia sat on a bench near the fountain with a small group of women, some from Morocco, some from Pakistan, others from Syria, Yemen, Sudan, refugees, maids, survivors, women who spoke little English but carried entire histories in their eyes. They called her Apa, Big Sister. She helped them fill out visa forms, translate letters, contact embassies, but more than that, she listened. She had learned that sometimes listening was the most sacred act of all, the way pain could transform simply by being heard. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the cherry trees, a young woman named Huda broke down in tears. She was from Yemen, only 21, barely speaking above a whisper. They took my passport, Huda said, trembling. The family I work for. They say I cannot leave. If I go, they call police. The word struck Sadia like a shadow from her own past. For a moment, the air around her thickened, the smell of detergent and polished marble flooding her memory. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on Huda's arm. Listen to me, she said softly, switching to Arabic. You will not go through this alone. Over the next week, Sadia helped her contact a legal aid group that worked with exploited workers. She even called Rachel, who quietly arranged for a reporter to document the abuse. When the case broke, a small local scandal this time, Sadia stood at a distance, watching the young woman step into the sunlight for the first time, free. The tears that ran down Sadia's face that day were not of sadness, but of recognition. For the first time, she realized that the truth she had carried like a burden could also be a lantern, something to light the way for others. As summer came, Sadia began to write again, not in secret this time. The notebook on her desk had grown thick with pages, her handwriting neat, measured, almost meditative. There are two kinds of prisons, she wrote. The ones they build for you and the ones you build for yourself. The first you can escape. The second you must forgive yourself to leave. Every evening she wrote a little more, fragments of her life, stories of the women she met, the quiet revolutions that happened in kitchens and cleaning closets. In whispered prayers and trembling refusals, Rachel visited again in July. She read a few pages and smiled. You're writing your own book? Sadia laughed softly. No, I'm just remembering. Before memory becomes dust. You should publish it, Rachel said, her eyes warm. In your own name this time? Sadia looked out the window at the setting sun. Maybe someday, when I'm ready to be seen, Rachel nodded. Then promise me you'll let the world hear you again when that day comes. Sadia didn't answer right away. She was thinking of all the voices that had been silenced before hers. Lydia, the girl from Baltimore. Elena, who vanished quietly from the story. The hundreds of women who still lived behind locked doors, unseen and unheard. Finally, she said, the world will hear us not as noise, but as truth. That autumn, Sadia received a letter from an unknown address. It was postmarked from a federal prison in Pennsylvania. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I think you were right to do what you did. Every night in this cell I hear your voice. I thought I had buried everything, but some things don't die when you bury them. They grow roots. You didn't destroy me. You uncovered me. Daniel Moreno. Sadia stared at the page for a long time. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, controlled. The same hand that once signed paychecks and lies alike. She felt no rage, no satisfaction. Only a quiet kind of pity for a man who finally saw the truth too late. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in a box with the few remnants of her old life. A Quran from her mother, a photo of her village, the newspaper clipping of Rachel's article. Then she closed the lid and whispered, "May God forgive us all." By the next spring she had moved again, this time to a quieter town near the sea. She worked at a small library, cataloguing old books and teaching English to new immigrants in the evenings. People there knew her only as Miss Sarah, the gentle librarian who always smiled and carried stories in her eyes. One rainy evening, a teenage girl stayed behind after class. "Miss Sarah," she said, "I heard about a woman once, a maid who exposed something terrible. They said she disappeared. Do you think she survived?" Sadia looked at her for a long moment, the corners of her lips lifting in a soft, secret smile. Yes, she said quietly, she did. And she learned that surviving isn't enough. You have to live. The girl smiled, unaware that she had just heard the truth from the story's ghost. That night, Sadia walked along the beach as waves crashed softly against the shore. The sky above was vast and starless, the air cool and salt-touched. She took off her shoes and let the cold water kiss her feet. For years she had lived as a shadow, moving through other people's homes, other people's lies. Now she belonged to no one and nothing but the open world before her. In her heart, she whispered a prayer. For Lydia, for Elena, for herself, for all the women still trapped behind unseen doors. And as the waves pulled back and returned again, as if erasing her footprints gently from the sand, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete, quiet freedom. She smiled, eyes closed, and said softly, "Behind every door there is a secret, but some secrets lead you here into the sea, to the sky, to a life you never dared to imagine." The tide rose higher, the wind carried her voice away, and for the first time in her life, Sadia did not hide, she simply existed, alive, unafraid, and free. The days that followed unfolded with a calm rhythm, the kind that only comes when one has finally stopped running. For the first time in her adult life, Sadia, now Sarah Malik, lived without fear of footsteps behind her. The small coastal town she had moved to was not much more than a cluster of cottages, a harbor, and a library that smelled of salt and old paper. Yet to her it was a kingdom of peace. Each morning she woke before sunrise, her window open to the soft roar of the Atlantic. She made tea, prayed, and sat on the balcony with her notebook and a wool shawl around her shoulders. Sometimes she wrote stories, sometimes she simply watched the sea, feeling its rhythm settle her heart. The waves had become her teacher. They reminded her that even when something breaks, a life, a name, a faith, it can find its shape again, endlessly returning to the shore. The townspeople had grown used to her presence. They called her the quiet woman with kind eyes. At the library, she spent her days sorting books, guiding students, and teaching immigrants how to read English. On weekends, she hosted a small circle of women who came to learn not just language, but courage, how to speak up, how to write their stories, how to stand tall even when their worlds had taught them to bow. It began quietly, this circle, 5 women sitting in the back room of the library. But over the months it grew. By summer there were 20, women from Pakistan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Mexico, Syria, each one carrying her own scars and silences. Sadia listened more than she spoke. When they asked her why she always smiled so gently even when the stories were heavy, she would answer, "Because you are writing your way out of the darkness. I know how it feels." They did not know the whole of her story, only fragments, that she had once been a maid, that she had seen terrible things, that she believed truth had the power to cleanse the world like rain. One evening, after class, a woman named Amina stayed behind. She had a burn mark on her wrist that she never explained. "Miss Sarah," she said softly, "why do you never tell your story?" Sadia paused. "Because my story is not about me anymore. It belongs to every woman who is still behind the door I left." Amina nodded slowly. "Then one day you must open that door for them too." That night those words stayed with her. Late that summer, Rachel came to visit again. Her hair had streaks of grey now, but her spirit was the same. Bright, restless, hungry for truth. They met at the Harbour Cafe, the same kind of small seaside place where nobody cared who you were, only that you paid for your tea and left in peace. Rachel ordered coffee and leaned forward, her voice low. "There's something I need to tell you." Sadia's stomach tightened. "What happened?" "They found Elena," Rachel said. Sadia's breath caught. "She's alive?" Rachel nodded. "Yes. She's been in Florida all this time, working for another family under a different name. When the FBI questioned the Moreno's old staff, she disappeared. I think she was afraid, but she reached out to me last week after seeing the book." Sadia's eyes filled with tears. For months, she had prayed for the woman who had saved her life that night. The thought of her being alive felt like a missing piece of her soul returning. "She wants to see you," Rachel said gently. A week later, Sadia boarded a bus heading south. It was a long journey, 12 hours through quiet towns and pine forests, but every mile carried a strange anticipation. The bus rocked gently as the scenery changed. from green fields to palms and flat blue horizons. When she arrived at the small Florida town, Rachel was already waiting at the station, smiling. And beside her stood Elena. Her hair was grayer, her limp slightly worse, but her eyes, the same warm brown eyes that once told her, "You've been through worse than this," had not changed. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Sadia stepped forward and embraced her. Both women cried quietly, the kind of tears that wash away years of silence. "You made it," Elena whispered. "So did you," Sadia replied. They spent the evening together at a small diner by the highway, talking until the sun sank into the Gulf. Elena told her everything, how she had fled after the police came, how she had lived under false names, cleaning houses, never telling anyone who she really was. "I thought I'd die invisible," she said softly, "but when I saw your story on TV, I knew I had to find you. I wanted to see you free with my own eyes." Sadia reached across the table and took her hand. "You're part of this freedom. Without you, I would have never made it out." Elena smiled weakly. "You made it out because you were brave. I just opened the door." That night back in her hotel room, Sadia couldn't sleep. The reunion had reopened something deep inside her, a memory she had buried for survival. She remembered the night she first arrived in America, full of hope, how she had believed that working in a rich home meant safety, how easily trust had turned into captivity. She remembered the faces of the Moreno's guests, politicians, businessmen, people who had smiled at her without ever seeing her, people who would have destroyed her life to protect their comfort. She remembered Lydia's laughter in the dining room, the way it had echoed against marble walls, unaware that it would one day be silenced. But most of all, she remembered the moment behind the kitchen door, the moment when she decided not to look away. That was when everything changed. She realized that every woman had her own kitchen door, the place where she overhears a truth too heavy to ignore, the place where she must choose between safety and conscience, and she understood at last that this story was not over. It had only changed shape. When she returned to Maryland, she began a new project at the library. It started as a simple writing workshop, but soon became something bigger. She called it the Voices Room. Every Saturday, the back room filled with women sharing their stories, maids, waitresses, caregivers, undocumented workers. They came with fear, shame, trembling voices. But week by week, their words grew louder, steadier. They wrote about the things no one ever asked: hunger, humiliation, hope. They wrote letters to their past selves, prayers to their lost mothers, confessions of small courage, and Sadia wrote with them. Her notebook was no longer just her refuge. It became a record of rebirth. One evening, as the session ended, one of the women, a young Afghan named Samira, said, "Miss Sarah, you should publish these stories. They can help so many people." Sadia hesitated. "These are your stories, not mine." Samira smiled. "But you gave us the voice to tell them. That makes them yours too." That night she stayed late at the library, typing their words into her computer. The title came to her quietly like a whisper from the past, behind every door. It was not a book about corruption or politics. It was about humanity, about what happens in the quiet spaces where power hides and ordinary women find the strength to stand up. When the manuscript was done, she mailed it anonymously to a publisher. She didn't expect anything to happen. But months later, a letter arrived. "Dear Ms. Malik, your collection is powerful beyond words. We would be honored to publish it. These voices will move the world." Sadia wept when she read it. The book came out the following year. It carried no photographs, no grand author bio, just a dedication. For those who whispered truth when no one was listening. It spread slowly, quietly, but its impact was immense. Universities taught it in courses on migration and gender. NGOs used it in workshops. In Pakistan, India, the Middle East, women translated it, shared it, spoke of it in community circles. Rachel called one day and said, "Sarah, your words have gone further than mine ever did." Sadia laughed softly. "Because they're not just mine." Years passed. Sadia grew older, her hair streaked with silver, her heart lighter. She stayed in that seaside town, surrounded by books, letters, and memories of women she had helped. One winter evening, she sat on the beach again. The waves were calmer now, the horizon wide and blue. She watched a mother and her daughter collecting shells along the shore. The little girl laughed, running toward the waves, fearless. Sadia smiled. She thought of the young woman she had once been, the one who had stood behind a kitchen door, afraid to breathe. She wished she could whisper to that girl across time, "Hold on. You will survive this. You will become the storm they tried to silence." The sea breeze carried her thoughts away. She felt no bitterness, no regret, only gratitude to God, to the truth, to every soul who had helped her along the way. As dusk settled, she opened her notebook one last time. The pages were nearly full. She wrote slowly, deliberately, her handwriting steady despite the cold. "Every secret I once feared became the seed of something beautiful. They tried to bury me under silence, but silence is where the truth learns to grow." She closed the book, stood and looked toward the horizon. The tide was rising again. Somewhere beyond that vast water, the world she had fled still turned with its noise, its power, its deceit. But here, on this quiet shore, truth lived freely, in her, in the waves, in the stories that would outlast them all. And with a soft smile, she whispered the same words that had once ended her nightmares and begun her freedom. "Behind every door there is a story, and some stories never end. They just find their voice in someone new." Years drifted by like tides, and the once hidden maid from the Moreno mansion became a quiet legend whispered about in places she would never visit. In universities in New York and London, professors quoted "Behind every door" to remind their students that history wasn't made only by those who ruled. Sometimes it was rewritten by those who cleaned the floors. In refugee shelters, women repeated lines from her pages as prayers. But in the little town by the Atlantic, Sadia, still Sarah Malik to her neighbors, lived a life so modest that most people who met her had no idea who she truly was. She worked mornings at the library, afternoons at the Women's Literacy Center, and evenings tending to her small garden of mint, basil and jasmine. Her body had grown slower, but her mind still burned with that sharp, careful watchfulness she had learned from years of silence. She could feel a storm of injustice before anyone else could name it. She could sense sadness in another woman's eyes before a single tear fell. And she had become the kind of listener people traveled miles to find. One late summer morning, she received a letter. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar, the paper thick and formal. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the first lines. Federal Court of the United States Notice of Clemency Hearing. Daniel Moreno. Her breath caught. It had been nearly 15 years since his sentencing. The words felt like an echo from another life. The letter explained that Mr. Moreno, now gravely ill, had applied for compassionate release. The court had requested testimony from witnesses affected by his case, including the anonymous maid, whose evidence had first exposed the crime. Sadia put the letter down, her heart heavy. The world outside her window looked the same. Children running to school, waves brushing the sand. But inside her the past stirred like dust rising from an old floor. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window as the moonlight pooled across her desk, reading her old notebooks. So many pages written in trembling hands. The voices of women she had helped. The confessions she had never spoken aloud. She thought of Daniel Moreno, his cold smile, his arrogance, the way he once leaned close and whispered, "Good girl." She remembered how his voice had shaken during the trial when her recording was played in court. Part of her wanted to forget him forever. Another part, older, quieter, wanted to see him one last time, not for revenge, but for understanding. 2 weeks later, she found herself on a train to Pennsylvania. The landscape rolled by in greens and browns, fading into the steel gray of the prison compound. The air smelled faintly of rain and iron. The guard at the front desk looked surprised when he saw her visitor pass. "You're here for Moreno?" he asked. She nodded. "Hasn't had a visitor in years," he muttered. "Doesn't talk to anyone." They led her down a long corridor, past echoing doors and the low hum of fluorescent lights. The sound of keys and footsteps followed her like ghosts. When she entered the small visitation room, he was already there, thin, pale, eyes sunken but still sharp. His hair had turned white. His hands trembled faintly on the table. He looked up and for a moment time folded back on itself. The years vanished, and she saw again the man who had once terrified her, the powerful employer whose smallest command had shaped her days. But now, he looked small, fragile, human. "I didn't think you'd come," he said finally. His voice was weaker, rasping. "I didn't think I would either," she replied. He smiled faintly. "You're still brave." "I remember that about you." Silence stretched between them. The guard stood far enough away that they couldn't hear. "You got my letter?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to see the face of the person who finally told the truth." Sadia studied him for a long time. "Why now?" He coughed, his hands shaking. "When you have nothing left, no wife, no money, no friends, you start hearing all the things you once silenced. I hear her voice sometimes. Lydia's, sometimes yours." Sadia's eyes softened but did not waver. "Truth doesn't die when you bury it," she said quietly. "It waits." He closed his eyes. "I thought power could buy peace, but it only bought me ghosts." For a moment pity flickered in her chest. Brief, fragile, real, she stood to leave. "I don't hate you anymore," she said. "But I won't speak for your freedom either. That's between you and God." He nodded slowly, tears filling his tired eyes. "Then I pray he listens to you before he listens to me." When she left the room, the world outside felt enormous. The sunlight stung her eyes. She walked out of the prison gates and breathed deeply. The air sharp with the scent of rain. For the first time, she felt the weight of the past loosen, like an old door creaking open to let light through. Months later, news came quietly. Daniel Moreno had died in his sleep, still behind bars. There were no headlines this time, no reporters. Only a brief notice in the paper that mentioned his conviction and nothing more. Sadia read it once, then folded the page and set it under a candle. She didn't pray for him exactly, but she whispered, "May justice rest where mercy allows." Life went on. The women's center she had built grew larger. Younger volunteers began to take over her classes. Her hands, once raw from cleaning, now trembled with age as she wrote. But her mind remained clear. One spring afternoon, she received a visit from a young journalist named Amira Khan. The girl was barely 25, full of energy and sharp questions. She was working on a documentary about immigrant women in America. "Everyone keeps mentioning you," Amira said. "You changed lives, but there's so little about you online. No photos, no interviews." "Why?" Sadia smiled. "Because the story isn't mine anymore. It belongs to the people who heard it." "But don't you want people to know who you were?" Amira pressed gently. "To know you were the one who brought down the Morenos." Sadia laughed softly. "If they remember my name, it means they've forgotten why I did it. Let them remember the lesson, not the woman." The young reporter fell silent for a while, watching the older woman with something like reverence. "You know," she said finally, "you remind me of the ocean. Always calm, but you can tell there's a storm underneath." Sadia smiled. "That's what truth does. It teaches you how to be both." Amira asked if she could film her hands while she wrote, not her face. Sadia agreed. The documentary aired months later, ending with that shot, a pair of aging hands, writing slowly in a notebook beside a window overlooking the sea. Her voice soft, accented steady, narrated over the final scene. "They say servants see everything." That's true, but the hardest thing to see is your own worth. Once you learn that, no one can make you small again. The years flowed on, gentle as the tides. One morning when she was nearly 70, Sadia walked down to the beach as she always did. The air was crisp, the horizon glowing with gold. The sea smelled of life and salt. She sat on her favorite bench, her cane leaning beside her, her notebook open on her lap. The page before her was blank except for a single sentence at the top. "Every wave that breaks still returns to the sea," she wrote beneath it, slowly, deliberately. "I once believed the truth would destroy me, but it became the ocean that carried me home." She paused, looking out at the horizon where water met sky. Children laughed somewhere behind her. The world felt impossibly full and tender. As the morning sun warmed her face, she closed her eyes, letting the sound of waves fill the silence that once terrified her. Somewhere far away, in archives and libraries, her words lived on, in books, in voices, in the quiet courage of strangers. And here, on this quiet shore, the woman who had once listened behind a kitchen door finally heard what she had been waiting for all along. The sound of peace, steady and endless, like the sea itself. Years later, when she was gone, the town librarian would find her last notebook neatly placed on her desk, the final line written in her delicate hand. "Behind every door I ever feared stood the same thing, light, That line would one day be carved into a stone by the sea, where visitors came to sit and read, the ocean wind turning the pages of her story. And sometimes, if the wind was right, the whisper of the waves sounded almost like a woman's voice, calm and steady, saying what she had always known to be true. Truth never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to open the door. Time had stretched into a kind of softness in the little coastal town. The waves still came and went. The seasons rolled over one another like the turning of an old patient clock, and the people who had once been children now came to the library with children of their own. The townsfolk called her Miss Sarah, even after her hair had turned white and her back began to curve. She became the one they sought when life bent under its own weight, when a husband was arrested, when a child fell sick, when a letter from immigration brought fear instead of hope. She listened without hurry, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes full of an understanding that seemed to reach beyond this world. One morning, near the end of autumn, a letter arrived with no return address. The envelope was thin, the paper yellowed at the edges. Inside was a single note in delicate Urdu script. To the one who taught me what truth feels like when it breathes, thank you. I have built a school for girls in my village in your name. We call it the Door of Light. Huda. Huda. The young Yemeni woman she had once helped escape from her employers. Sadia smiled as she traced the lines of the handwriting, her eyes glistening. Somewhere far away, another door had opened. Another life had changed. That night she sat beside her window, listening to the wind carry the faint crash of the sea against the rocks. She whispered, Alhamdulillah, and for a moment she felt the world as a single breathing thing, every heart connected by threads of unseen courage. Winter came, and with it, quiet. Snow rarely reached the coast, but this year it did. Thin flakes falling over the harbor, softening every noise, turning the world to silver. Sadia watched from her small balcony, the cup of chai warming her trembling fingers. Rachel called that evening. Her voice, though older now, still carried that spark of purpose. I'm coming up next week, she said. The university wants to do a conference on social justice. They're dedicating it to you. Sadia laughed gently. Though you know I won't attend that, Rachel. Rachel chuckled on the other end. I know, but I'll bring them your words. They're expecting something, maybe a letter, a message. Sadia thought for a long moment. Tell them that justice is not a verdict. It's a way of living. I'll write that down, Rachel said softly. Before hanging up, her tone turned serious. Sarah, you've done more good than most people I've met in my entire career. But when are you going to write about yourself? The whole story? Sadia's gaze turned to the sea. When I no longer need to protect the girl I once was. As the days grew shorter, her steps slowed. Her joints stiffened. Her breath came quicker with effort. Yet every dawn she still walked to the water. It had become her prayer to the earth, to keep moving toward light no matter how heavy the body grew. Sometimes she would see the young journalist Amira again, now older, her documentaries winning awards. Amira always visited with a camera slung over her shoulder, a notebook full of questions. On one visit, she told Sadia, "Your book has been translated into 9 languages now. There are community centers named after your writing." Sadia smiled faintly. "Then I've lived many lives already." Amira looked at her seriously. "Do you ever regret it? Exposing them?" Sadia's answer came without hesitation. "No, I regret only that I didn't speak sooner. I could have saved that girl in Baltimore." Amira lowered her eyes. "You did in another way. You saved many more." Sadia reached across the table, laying her wrinkled hand gently over Amira's. "Then promise me something. Anything. When my story ends, don't make it about pain. Make it about faith." One evening, after the sun had slipped behind a curtain of pale clouds, Sadia returned home from the library carrying a small bundle of letters. Her old cat, a stray that had wandered into her life years ago, waited at the door. The air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. She placed the letters on her desk, brewed tea, and sat down to write again. This time she began not with thoughts of injustice or memory, but with gratitude. "When I was a child in Karachi," she wrote, "my mother told me that truth is a kind of light, dangerous if you stare too long, but beautiful when it finds the right place to fall. For years I feared it would burn me. Now I know. It only shows what was always there." She wrote until her hand cramped and her candle burned low. Before she slept, she opened the window. The cold night air brushed her face, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined she saw all the women she had met through the years, Huda, Amina, Samira, even Lydia, standing by the water, their faces turned toward the horizon. The sea shimmered faintly, like a mirror of memory. The next morning, the librarian found the door unlocked, the kettle still warm. Saadia was sitting in her chair by the window, eyes closed, her notebook open on her lap. Her face was peaceful, touched by the first light of dawn. The last words written in her notebook were these: "Truth is not what we tell others. It is what we choose to live by when no one is watching." The town buried her by the sea, beside the bench where she used to sit. The inscription on her simple headstone read, "Sarah Malik Saadia." She opened the door and light walked in. In the years that followed, her story rippled outward like waves meeting distant shores. The Voices Room continued under new guidance, becoming an international network. Her books were reprinted, her lessons taught in classrooms, and every year on the anniversary of her passing, women gathered by the bench overlooking the sea. Some were locals, others came from far away, women who had once lived in silence, now reading aloud letters of truth, hope, and forgiveness. They called it the Day of Doors. At sunset, they would open paper lanterns shaped like small doors and set them on the waves, each one glowing softly as it drifted out to sea. Children would ask, "Why do you send them away?" And the women would answer, "Because truth must keep traveling." Decades later, a museum in Baltimore dedicated an entire wing to the House of Voices. Inside a glass case, under soft light sat a single object, an old, worn notebook with faded ink and tear stains between the lines. On the open page was her handwriting, elegant, steady, immortal. Behind every door there is a story, but only when we open it with courage does the story set us free. Tourists read the plaque beside it, but the women who knew the story never needed the explanation. They said her name quietly with reverence, Saadia. The maid who once stood in fear behind a kitchen door had become something eternal, not a victim, not a hero, but the keeper of truth that outlives its tellers. And if one listened closely at night, when the sea winds rolled through the old town and brushed against her stone by the shore, it almost sounded like a whisper carried across time itself. You can silence a voice, but you can never silence the truth it carried. That whisper lived on, finding its way into the hearts of those who still dared to listen, just as it had begun behind a door in a kitchen, in the quiet heart of a woman who refused to forget what she heard. Years had melted into decades, and the sea beside the town no longer crashed with the same youthful energy. It sighed now, as if it too had grown older. The waves came slower, gentler, carrying the weight of all that time, and returned with whispers of everything the shore had seen. The town had changed. The cobblestone streets were lined with small cafes, painted bright colors by young artists who had moved there from the cities. Tourists visited in the summer, drawn by the legend of the Door of Light and the woman whose bench by the sea had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Her name, Sarah Malik, was now carved not just in stone but in the memory of people who had never met her. Children born long after her death would pass by the statue that stood near the harbor, bronze, simple, depicting an old woman seated with a notebook open on her lap. At her feet were the words she had once written in her final years. Every secret is a locked door. Some we must guard, and some we must open to let the light through. The local school took its students there every spring. Teachers told them that this town had been the home of a woman who had turned silence into justice and kindness into something larger than forgiveness. The children would sit by the sea, trying to imagine what it meant to have lived a life so quiet, yet so thunderous, and but history, as it always does, left behind more than monuments. In a dusty storage room of the library where she had once worked, a young archivist named Layla was cataloguing old boxes when she came across a plain folder marked simply SM. Inside were letters, hundreds of them. Some were from women around the world who had written to Saadia after reading Behind Every Door. Some were replies in her delicate handwriting, full of compassion and grace. Others were private notes she had never sent, fragments of thought, pain, longing. Layla spent hours reading, her eyes wide, heart heavy. There is a kind of love that exists only in silence, one letter said. The love between the one who suffers and the one who listens, another read. Every woman I meet carries a locked room in her chest. My task is not to open it, but to give her the key to do it herself. There were drafts of speeches she had never given, essays unfinished, prayers scribbled in the margins of bills and recipes. In one note, Sadia had written to Rachel but never mailed it. If they ever tell our story, Rachel, I want them to remember that I was not a heroine. I was just a woman who stopped pretending she couldn't hear what the world was whispering. Layla wiped her tears and called her supervisor. We can't keep these hidden, she said. Within months, the letters became an exhibit, the hidden pages of Sarah Malik. Visitors came from across the country, reading her words behind glass displays, their faces lit by the faint glow of truth that her pen had once carried. Meanwhile, far away in Karachi, the school named the Door of Light had grown into a small campus. Girls in neat uniforms studied under murals, painted with quotes from Sadia's writings. On one wall above the library door was written in both Urdu and English, "Truth begins with listening." The headmistress, now an older woman herself, often told the students, "The one you know as Sarah Malik was born in this very city." She listened when others stayed silent. She carried our voices across the ocean, and every year on her birthday the girls would write letters, not to her but for her. Letters of gratitude, of dreams, of courage. They sent them out in envelopes with no address, because, as one of the teachers would say, some people don't need an address. The world itself remembers them. In Baltimore, a young journalist named Nadia Hunt, granddaughter of Rachel, was preparing a new documentary. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about the mysterious maid whose courage had cracked open an empire. While researching, Nadia visited the same prison in Pennsylvania where Daniel Moreno had once been held. The warden, an old man with kind eyes, told her something she hadn't read anywhere. When Moreno died, he said, he left a single note. No one ever published it. It's still here in the archives. He handed her a thin folder. Inside on yellow paper were these words, "To the woman I wronged most, I once believed truth was a weapon. I learned too late that it was a mirror. Thank you for showing me what it reflects." Nadia read it 3 times, the gravity of it sinking in. The story she thought she knew had another layer, redemption, or something close to it. That night she walked by the harbor, standing where Lydia Santos's memorial now stood. The wind off the water felt colder than she expected. She whispered softly, "You weren't forgotten." Nadia's documentary, The Door That Spoke, premiered the following year. It opened not with images of the scandal, nor footage of the trial, but with an old audio recording of Sadia herself, her voice calm and steady, saying, "They called me a maid, but I was never just that. I was a witness, and a witness must decide whether silence is kindness or cowardice." The documentary swept through film festivals, won awards, and reawakened the world's fascination with her story. But what moved audiences most wasn't the scandal. It was the humanity, the way she forgave without surrendering truth, the way she found peace without erasing pain. Her story began to be taught not as tragedy, but as testimony. In the years that followed, the sea town became a small center for writers, poets, and teachers. The house where she had lived was turned into a retreat for women artists. On the walls hung photographs of her small garden, her notebook, and the view from her balcony. The air carried the smell of old paper and sea salt, the 2 things she had loved most. One evening during a writer's retreat, a young woman from Egypt stood at the window where Sadia once sat. She whispered, "Thank you," not knowing who she was speaking to, only that she felt something alive in the stillness. Outside, the tide came in, slow and deliberate. Then came a day when a young girl, barely 12, visited the memorial with her grandmother. The girl, curious, asked, "Grandma, was she really just a maid?" The grandmother smiled. "Once, yes. But the world changes when a maid learns to tell the truth." The girl frowned, thinking deeply. "Then maybe everyone has a door like hers." Her grandmother nodded. "Yes, my dear. The question is whether you're brave enough to open it." That night, as the sea breathed under the moonlight, the waves touched the shore with the same rhythm they always had. The stars shimmered faintly, and a breeze carried across the water a sound almost like a sigh, almost like a whisper. If someone had stood near the bench and listened carefully, they might have heard it, the echo of a voice once human, now eternal. You cannot choose what truths come to you, but you can choose what you do when you hear them. And perhaps that is how all stories live on, not in statues or headlines, but in the quiet courage passed from one soul to another, generation after generation, like a candle lit behind a door that never fully closes. For even now, after all the years, the legend of the maid behind the kitchen door endures, not as a tale of sorrow, but as the story of light finding its way into the smallest, darkest rooms of the human heart. And every time a woman anywhere in the world dares to speak, to write, to say no, somewhere in the sound of that voice, Sadia still lives, not as a memory but as the truth itself, walking again through another open door. The world had changed beyond recognition. The kind of world Sadia once knew, the one of whispered conversations behind kitchen doors and folded letters hidden beneath prayer rugs, had faded into the digital glow of 1,000 open screens. Voices that once trembled in silence now traveled across oceans in seconds. Stories once suppressed were shared, retold, reshaped, and immortalized. And yet in this new age of endless noise, her voice, the quiet, unwavering voice of truth, remained different. It had no advertisements, no hashtags, no fury. It lived in stillness, in reflection, in the invisible corners where humanity still paused to listen. Half a century after Sadia's passing, the sea town that had once been her refuge had transformed into something of a sacred archive. The House of Voices, a global foundation named in her honor, stood where her small library once had. It was a place that belonged to no nation or government. It belonged, as its plaque declared, to those who have ever been silenced. Each year, scholars, journalists, and women from across the world came here to study her writings. The air itself seemed alive with remembrance. The building's architecture was designed in her spirit, minimal, with wide open halls where sunlight fell like pages of gold, and doors, hundreds of doors, each one inscribed with quotes from women she had once inspired. At the center of the hall stood her original bench, brought from the seaside and preserved exactly as it had been, weathered by time and sea salt. Beside it sat her final notebook, enclosed in glass. The ink on the last page had faded slightly, but the words were still legible. Behind every door I ever feared stood the same thing, light. The director of the foundation was a woman named Noor Malik, Sadia's great niece, though she never knew her aunt personally. Noor had grown up in Karachi, hearing faint family rumors about the aunt who disappeared to America. As a child, those stories had seemed almost mythical, until one day, while studying literature abroad, she stumbled upon Behind Every Door. She had recognized the tone instantly, the rhythm, the small Urdu phrases woven into the English text, the particular tenderness of the voice. She knew in her bones that this woman was family. Now, as she stood in that luminous hall, she felt the inheritance of something far greater than blood, a legacy of courage. One afternoon, Noor received a package from a university in Baltimore. Inside was an old sealed envelope labeled, "For whoever carries her name." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was brittle with age, but the handwriting, curved, deliberate, graceful, was unmistakable. "To the one who will come after me, I do not know your name or your face, or the century in which you will live. But I know this, you will still be fighting a battle I could not finish. I once believed that truth was enough to change the world. But truth is only a seed. It needs hands, your hands, to plant it again and again. Promise me, when the world becomes loud with anger and pride, you will still make room for silence. It is in silence that courage begins. With love and faith, Sadia." Noor pressed the paper to her chest. The letter felt alive, as if her great-aunt had written it yesterday. Months later, Noor stood on a stage at the annual Voices Symposium, facing a crowd of thousands. The audience was a mosaic of generations, elders who remembered the scandal that began it all, and young women who knew Sadia only as a name on their college syllabi. Behind Noor, on a wide digital screen, appeared Sadia's image, a restored photograph Rachel had once taken but never published. In it, Sadia sat at her desk, the soft light of dawn falling over her notebook. She wasn't posing. She wasn't aware of the camera. She was simply being. Noor began to speak. 50 years ago, my great-aunt wrote that silence is where courage begins. Today, we live in a world that fears silence. We fill it with words, with opinions, with noise. But truth, real truth, does not shout. It waits. My aunt was once a maid, an immigrant, invisible to those who ate from the plates she washed. But she listened, and because she listened, the world changed. Today we honor her not as a victim, but as the beginning of something timeless. The faith that one voice, however small, can carry the weight of justice. The hall was silent. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Noor then read from Sadia's old letters, stories of the women she had helped, of Lydia, of Huda, of Elena. Their names, once forgotten, were now spoken aloud again, filling the air with something sacred. When she finished, she walked to the bench at the center of the hall and placed the letter on it, the one addressed to whoever carries her name. And she whispered, "You kept your promise. Now it's ours to keep." That night, Noor visited the shore where her aunt had once walked every morning. The sea was calmer than she expected, glowing faintly under the moonlight. A few lanterns drifted across the water, remnants of the Day of Doors ceremony that had just ended. She sat down on the sand, closing her eyes, listening to the same tide her aunt had once heard, and then softly, almost imperceptibly, she heard something else, a voice, not in sound but in memory. Truth doesn't end when we die. It becomes the wind that carries the next word. Tears streamed down her face, though she was smiling. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, vast and forgiving like time itself. The next morning, the town awoke to a rare sight. A rainbow arched over the harbor, its colors reflected in the calm sea. Local fishermen said they hadn't seen one like it in decades. In the House of Voices, the doors stood open, sunlight spilling through. Visitors walked quietly among the exhibits. In one corner, a small screen played an audio file that had only recently been restored from Rachel Hunt's old tapes. It was Sadia's voice, faint but clear, saying, "If my words outlive me, do not make them holy. Just let them remind you to listen, to the world, to yourself, to the small truths that hide in the noise. Every truth, once spoken, finds its echo. And if you are very still, you will hear it too." People stood for long minutes listening. Some wept, some smiled. Others simply closed their eyes. Outside, the waves rolled in and rolled back, endless and faithful. That evening, Noor sat at her desk in her apartment overlooking the sea, the same view Sadia had once cherished. She opened her laptop and began to type her own letter. "To the one who will come after me, you do not know me, but you will know her. You will read her story, feel her silence, and understand that every truth costs something. Remember this, courage is not a moment. It is a lineage, so when the time comes for you to open your own door, do it even if your hands tremble, especially if they tremble." When she was done, she closed her eyes, letting the hum of the sea fill the room. Somewhere in that sound, she could almost hear her great aunt laughing softly, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy, but from peace. And so the story continued, no longer bound to one woman, one century, or one country. It lived in 1,000 different languages, in millions of ordinary acts of truth. A girl in Jakarta, refusing to lie for her boss. A journalist in Nairobi, exposing a minister's crime. A migrant worker in Dubai keeping a diary of her days. A teacher in Lahore telling her, "Students, that bravery begins with listening." Each one of them, knowingly or not, carried a spark of her. The woman who once stood behind a kitchen door and chose to listen, instead of turning away, and the sea kept singing her story. Because some truths never fade, they travel, they transform, they wait for the next trembling hand to open the next door. And when that door opens, and light spills through, Sadia, Sarah Malik, the maid who became the echo of truth, lives again. The morning sun hung low over the Atlantic, its light scattered like molten gold across the surface of the water. Seagulls wheeled above the harbor, their cries echoing softly through the air. The world felt timeless, as if each sunrise and each wave carried within it all the moments that had ever happened here. It was the 100th year since Sadia's birth. The town had changed beyond recognition, yet her presence had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, not as memory, but as a kind of pulse that lived inside the rhythm of the sea itself. The House of Voices had expanded, its walls now lined with digital archives and holographic displays. But at the heart of it all, nothing had changed. The bench, the notebook, the sound of her voice saying softly, "Truth never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to open the door." The centennial celebration was unlike any the town had ever seen. Thousands of people, from Karachi, Cairo, New York, Jakarta, London, came to honor her. Scholars, journalists, artists, mothers, daughters, maids, refugees, all gathered to celebrate not fame, not politics, but the quiet power of an ordinary woman who had once chosen to tell the truth when silence was safer. That morning, the ceremony began with silence. No speeches, no music, just a moment to listen to the wind. The sea was calm, the air still, and for 60 long seconds, the world stood still in collective memory. Then, slowly the sounds returned, the low hum of a choir, singing in a dozen languages, Urdu, English, Arabic, Swahili, French. Their voices rose like the tide, weaving her words into melody. Behind every door there is light. Behind every silence there is a story. Behind every woman there is a world waiting to be born. The audience wept quietly. Even those who had not known her felt the enormity of her presence. A century later, she was still opening doors. After the ceremony, Noor Malik, now an old woman herself, her white hair tucked beneath a light shawl, stood before the sea. Her body trembled slightly, but her eyes burned with the same fierce gentleness that had defined her great-aunt. She carried a small object wrapped in linen, a relic that had been preserved in her family for generations. Slowly she unfolded the fabric. Inside was Sadia's old pen, the one she had used to write behind every door. Its metal was tarnished, but the engraving near the nib was still visible. To write is to remember. Noor turned to the gathered crowd and spoke, her voice unsteady but clear. She was not a saint. She was not a scholar. She was a woman who heard the world's pain and refused to pretend she didn't. That is all. And that is everything. She held the pen up toward the sun. Its silver tip caught the light, scattering it like a blade made of dawn. This was her weapon, not a gun, not a sword, but a pen, a tool of witness. She used it to tell the truth when others were paid to forget it. The crowd fell silent again. Today, we do not build statues to her. We build schools, shelters, and libraries. We open doors for others as she once did for us. Then, with trembling hands, Noor walked to the edge of the pier and lowered the pen into a crystal case embedded in a pedestal of stone. Etched into it were Sadia's words in both Urdu and English. Truth is not power. Truth is presence. The case was sealed beneath glass, open to the sky. When the sunlight struck it, the pen gleamed as if writing once more upon the horizon. In the crowd stood a young girl named Mariam, 14 years old, dark eyes wide with curiosity. Her mother had brought her all the way from Lahore for this celebration. Mariam had read Behind Every Door in school, and though she hadn't understood all its politics, she had understood its heart. She felt as if she had known Sadia her whole life. After the ceremony, she wandered away from the crowd and found the bench by the sea, the same bench where Sadia had once written her final words. It was warm from the sunlight. She sat down, pulled a notebook from her backpack and began to write. "Dear Miss Sarah Malik," she began, "I don't know you, but I think you know me. Sometimes I am afraid to speak. Sometimes I keep my truth quiet because it feels too small, but then I think of you and I feel brave again." Her handwriting was awkward, her sentences uneven, but her heart was steady. She kept writing until the tide came in and her mother called her back. When she left, the wind caught the corner of her notebook, flipping it open. The words shimmered faintly in the sunlight, as if the sea itself had paused to read them. That evening, after the visitors departed, and the sky turned the color of copper and rose, the House of Voices glowed softly against the dusk. Inside, a caretaker made her rounds, checking each exhibit. When she reached the old bench, she noticed something new, a small folded piece of paper resting on the seat. Curious, she opened it. It was Mariam's note. The caretaker smiled and carried it to the curator, who decided to keep it. It was placed in a glass frame beside Sadia's final notebook. The new plaque read, "A century later, the conversation continues," and so it did. The next morning, the sea was wild again, restless, as if stirred by unseen memory. Storm clouds gathered over the horizon, but the people of the town were unafraid. They had lived long enough to know that the sea, like truth, could rage without warning, yet always returned to calm. As the waves crashed against the rocks, the wind carried a sound that some swore was not wind at all, but a whisper, low, rhythmic, almost like a voice. Listen, truth does not end when one life ends, it travels. It finds new hands, new hearts, new tongues. The people who stood by the harbor said they could feel something in the air. Not fear, not sorrow, but gratitude. Months later, Mariam's letter went viral after a journalist photographed it at the exhibit. It was translated into more than 30 languages. The simplicity of her words touched something in millions of people around the world. Movements began again, small, organic, led by women in villages, cities, refugee camps, universities. They called it the Door Movement. Its message was not rebellion or anger. It was something quieter, harder, more enduring. Listen, speak, heal, and in every gathering, from Karachi to Kenya, from California to Cairo, people would light small lanterns shaped like doors and whisper her words before releasing them into the night sky. Behind every door, there is light. Years continued to flow like tides, but the name Sarah Malik no longer belonged only to one woman. It had become a symbol, a promise, a seed of truth planted in countless hearts. In classrooms, children learned about her not as history, but as a verb. To Sadia, something meant to tell the truth with love, no matter the cost. And so, in a way, she had never left. On the 100th anniversary of her death, a young filmmaker released a new documentary. It began with the same old recording, her voice, still clear, still calm. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, but maybe not. Because every time you tell a story that matters, I am there, behind your words, behind your courage, behind your door. The camera lingered on the sea, her sea, rolling endlessly under the morning light. Then slowly the frame faded to black, and her final words appeared on screen. You will never find me in statues or books. You will find me where the truth trembles, waiting to be spoken. And somewhere beyond the frame, perhaps carried by wind or memory or prayer, her whisper continued, not ending, but passing forward as the world kept listening. By the time another generation had arrived, the sea no longer seemed to separate nations. It connected them. Cargo ships and wind-powered ferries crossed the horizon daily, carrying not just goods, but the shared stories of people who had learned, little by little, to listen again. The Door movement had spread across continents, changing the vocabulary of social change itself. It no longer marched in the streets. It gathered in classrooms, cafes, prayer rooms, shelters, even kitchens, where conversations began the same way they had once begun for Sadia, quietly, truthfully, behind closed doors that no longer stayed closed for long. In Karachi, the Door of Light School now taught 2,000 students. Its walls were covered in murals of women reading, writing, and laughing, images of life rather than tragedy. A portrait of Sadia hung above the entrance, painted not as a saint, but as an ordinary woman with tired eyes and gentle hands holding a pen. In Baltimore, a university had named its new Department of Ethics and Journalism after her, the Sarah Malik Center for Truth and Witness. Each semester, young reporters from around the world came to learn how to tell stories that didn't exploit pain, but honored it. The motto carved in the marble lobby was simple: courage begins with listening. And in that same town by the Atlantic, where she had once lived her last years, the sea still sang her name. It was there that a new story began. The morning was grey, the sky low and damp. The town librarian, an older man named Elias, was walking through the archives when he found a box mislabeled Miscellaneous Papers. 2031. It was tucked behind a stack of climate reports gathering dust. When he opened it, he found not reports but audio tapes, hundreds of them, each one labeled by hand. Conversations, the women's room. They were Sadia's recordings, the very ones she had made during the early days of her writing circles. Recordings everyone thought had been lost to flood damage decades ago. Elias trembled as he lifted the first tape from the box. The handwriting was neat, fragile, Amina, week 2, on fear and faith. He took it to the Media Restoration Lab, where old technologies were handled like ancient relics. Within days, the tapes were cleaned, digitized, and uploaded into the House of Voices archive. When the first one played, the sound filled the hall with something electric and intimate, a gathering of laughter, accent-heavy English, and the occasional clatter of teacups. Then came her voice, Sadia's voice, calm, slow, patient. Don't rush your story, my sisters. Truth doesn't like to be forced. It's like water, it finds its own path. And then another voice, trembling but determined. "Miss Sarah, I'm scared to say it out loud," Sadia replied softly. "Then whisper it first." That's how every roar begins. The audience listening in the hall, students, journalists, tourists, fell utterly silent. The recording continued. "We think truth must be shouted to be heard," she said. "But sometimes, the world only understands when you say it softly enough that it must come close to listen." Her words hung in the air long after the tape ended. The rediscovered tapes became a phenomenon. Within weeks, streaming platforms began to air the Sarah Malik recordings, a podcast series combining her old audio with new interviews from those inspired by her work. Millions listened across languages and borders. People paused on subways and buses to hear the voice of a woman long gone, speaking as if she were right beside them. "Truth is a guest," she said in one recording. "If you want it to stay, treat it kindly. Justice without mercy becomes vengeance," said another. But mercy without truth is just fear wearing a soft face. The simplicity, the depth, it reached places the modern world had forgotten how to reach. Meanwhile, in Karachi, one of the students at the Door of Light, a girl named Amal, only 15, watched the recordings with fascination. She had been born in a narrow alley of Liari, her father a dock worker, her mother a midwife. Yet when she listened to Sadia's voice, she felt as though the woman was speaking directly to her. One day she told her teacher, "I want to go to America one day, to see her bench by the sea." The teacher smiled. "You don't need to go that far, Amal. The sea she loved is the same one that touches our shores." But Amal was stubborn. She began writing essays, winning competitions, saving every scholarship rupee. She read everything about Sadia behind every door, the hidden pages and letters to light. By 23, she earned a fellowship to the Sarah Malik Center for Truth and Witness in Baltimore. Her first day there, she stood beneath the engraved motto, "Courage begins with listening," and whispered to herself, "I'm here, Miss Sarah." That evening she visited the old seaside town, now preserved like a memory frozen in salt and stone. The Atlantic wind bit at her face as she walked down to the water. The bench was still there, smooth and sun-faded, with the small inscription she had memorized from pictures. She opened the door, and light walked in. Amal sat down, her hands trembling slightly. The sky was streaked with lavender and silver, the sea restless. She opened her notebook, the same kind Sadia had once used, and began to write. "You taught me that truth can come from anyone, even a girl from the docks. You said to whisper it first. So here is my whisper. I am scared, but I am ready." Back in Pakistan, her mother received a letter weeks later. Inside was a single photo, Amal standing by the bench, smiling into the wind. On the back of the photo, in her daughter's handwriting, were the words, "Behind every wave there is another voice waiting to rise." Her mother pressed the picture to her chest and cried, not from sorrow, but from something like pride mixed with awe. Over the years that followed, Jamal became a journalist, then an author, then something larger, a continuation. Her first book, Whispers of the Tide, told the stories of working-class women across South Asia who risked everything to tell the truth about corruption, abuse and inequality. When it won international awards, Amal stood on stage and quoted Sadia's words without changing a single syllable. "I'm not a hero. I am just a woman who stopped pretending I didn't hear what the world was whispering." The crowd rose to their feet. By then, the Door movement had spread into education reform, mental health advocacy, even environmental action. Wherever injustice thrived, someone invoked Sadia's name. And every time a woman began her story, she began with the same words. Behind the kitchen door. Those words had become sacred, not because they were hers alone, but because they had become everyone's. In her final years, Amal returned to that seaside bench again. She was no longer young. Her own hair had begun to grey, her hands strong from a lifetime of writing. Beside her sat a young intern, her student Lena, barely 19, who had grown up reading her work. Lena asked softly, "Do you ever wonder what she would say if she saw all this?" Amal smiled, looking at the horizon. She'd tell us not to make her into an idol. She'd remind us to keep listening. Lena tilted her head. "Listening to what?" Amal turned toward her, her eyes glistening with salt and memory. "To the quiet things," she said. "That's where truth hides. The waves crashed softly against the rocks, the wind wrapping around their conversation like an embrace. And for a fleeting moment, Amal thought she could hear another sound mingling with the sea, a whisper gentle and eternal. "Well done, my daughter." That night, as the moon rose over the water, Amal opened her notebook one last time. On the final page, she wrote the words that would later be engraved beneath her own name. I listened. And I answered. Then she closed the notebook, stood up, and placed it on the bench, the same bench where a century earlier another woman had once sat, pen in hand, writing the same truth that would never die. The wind lifted the first page, fluttering it open. The ink shimmered in the moonlight, and for a moment, it was impossible to tell whose words they were, Sadia's, Amal's, or the sea's, because by then, they had all become one voice, a voice that had crossed generations, crossed oceans, crossed silence itself. And still, it spoke. Still, it whispered, "Behind every door, there is light, and behind every voice brave enough to speak, there I am." The century had turned twice since the night Sadia first pressed her ear to that kitchen door, yet her echo still moved through the world, softer now, but deeper, the way a river grows wider as it approaches the sea. Her name had become something between legend and language, her life retold in classrooms, films, lullabies, even prayers. But beneath all that grandeur, what remained truly hers was something no monument could hold. The simple, fragile belief that truth, once spoken, would keep finding new tongues to speak through. The town by the Atlantic had changed again. The old harbor where fishermen once cast their nets was now a sweeping promenade of white stone, lined with lamps powered by the tides. The House of Voices stood at its center, taller than before but still simple, a structure of open light and moving air. It had become more than a museum. It was now the beating heart of an international network that gathered voices from the forgotten corners of the earth. Inside, the original bench, Sadia's bench, was surrounded by an installation called The Door That Listens. It wasn't an exhibit in the ordinary sense. Visitors walked through a long, dim hallway lined with projected doorways. As they passed each door, the sound of someone's recorded story, a confession, a song, a whisper, floated toward them, blending with the hum of the ocean. No two visits were the same. Every hour the doors changed their voices, pulling from the global archive of testimonies that people continued to send from refugee camps, rural schools, and crowded cities. On the wall beyond the last doorway glowed her words in quiet silver script. "Every story is a door. We open it not to escape, but to return to ourselves." The first director of this new generation was a young historian named Hana. She was 28, born in Dhaka, raised between continents, fluent in half a dozen languages, and restless with the kind of conviction that Sadia would have recognized instantly. Hana had grown up watching her mother struggle to be heard in rooms filled with louder, richer men. When she was 15, her mother gave her a tattered copy of Behind Every Door and told her, "Read this when the world feels too heavy." This woman carried more than both of us and still stood. Now, years later, Hana walked through the very halls that bore Sadia's name, carrying that same old book in her bag wherever she went. She had come to the Atlantic town to digitize what remained of Sadia's archives. But she stayed because she realized it wasn't archives that needed preserving. It was attention. In a world drowning in information, she saw that people had stopped truly listening. They read, watched, shared, shouted, but they no longer absorbed. And without that stillness, truth could not take root. One night, while reviewing new submissions for the archive, Hana came across a file labeled simply Audio Karachi Market, 2097. It was dated only weeks earlier. When she played it, she heard the crackle of street sounds, vendors calling out prices, the hum of traffic, and then a girl's voice, young and steady, reciting something in Urdu. Har sach ek roshni hai, aur har roshni ek awaaz ban sakti hai. Every truth is a light and every light can become a voice. Hana froze. She knew those words. They weren't in Sadia's books, but in one of her lost letters, the ones never meant for publication. Somehow someone across the world still carried them. She ran the voice-matching software. The girl's name appeared in the submission. Lena Amal. Her pulse quickened. Amal student. The girl who had once sat by Sadia's bench decades ago, listening to the sea. Hannah read the attached message. My teacher told me that stories never die, they only rest in other people. I found her old notebook floating near the sea wall after a storm. Inside were pages ruined by water, but a few words survived. I'm sending them so her voice can live again. The file attached contained scanned pages, fragments of handwriting, half-inked sentences, some illegible, others heartbreakingly clear. Oh, truth has a body, and it breathes through whoever carries it next. If I ever fade, promise me you'll keep writing, even if your hands tremble. Light doesn't ask permission to enter, it only needs a crack. Hannah felt tears roll down her face. She whispered, "You kept your promise, Miss Sarah." The discovery of Amal's lost notebook reignited something global. Universities reopened forgotten archives, tracing connections between Sadia's writings and the countless voices her story had inspired. New artists created music woven from the rhythms of her quotes. Poets translated her words into digital art, and in Karachi, students projected her sentences in light across the walls of the city at night. From above, it looked as though an invisible hand had written a single phrase across the entire cityscape. Behind every door, light. In a way, it was as if Sadia had come home. That same year, Hannah launched a project that would change the House of Voices forever. She called it the Door Network. It was an artificial intelligence built not to speak but to listen, trained on thousands of hours of testimony, stories, and recordings from around the world. Unlike other machines, it didn't interrupt, correct, or categorize. It listened silently, and when someone finished telling their story, the system responded not with analysis, but with a single line from Sadia's writings that fit the emotion of what it had heard. A young mother in Syria once told her story to the system, crying as she described losing her home. When she finished, the AI softly replied in Arabic, "The heart can break and still make room for mercy." A journalist in Brazil spoke about censorship, and the system answered, "Truth cannot be outlawed. It only learns new languages." The world called it the first empathetic archive. Hannah called it Sadia, a fitting name for a machine that could remind the living to remain human. One evening, long after the visitors had left, Hannah stood alone by the bench. The sky was dark except for the moon, a thin crescent mirrored in the water. The museum lights dimmed automatically, leaving only the glow of the inscription at her feet. She thought about the hundreds of women whose stories now filled her servers, the laughter, the grief, the defiance. And she realized that this too was a kind of prayer. She sat on the bench and whispered into the wind, as though speaking to someone sitting beside her. "Miss Sarah, the world is loud again, but they are listening. You would be proud." And then, as if in answer, a faint breeze swept over the sea, carrying with it a sound. Not quite a word, not quite silence. A sigh, maybe, or a whisper. I never needed them to remember me, only to remember how to listen, Hannah smiled. "We remember," she said softly. "We do." Years passed. The House of Voices expanded into other continents. A branch in Nairobi, another in Manila, another in São Paulo. The Sadia network became a living chorus of truth, collecting stories faster than any human historian could. Yet, at its core, it remained what its namesake had intended, a space for quiet courage. Children came on school trips to sit by the digital doors, placing their palms on glowing panels that played recordings from other children their age, from faraway places in languages they didn't know. And though they couldn't understand every word, they felt the emotion, the trembling edge of truth that needed no translation. The teachers would tell them, "That's what listening feels like." And sometimes, when the children looked toward the sea, they swore they could see her shadow, a figure in a simple shawl, notebook in hand, watching them with a smile that belonged to no century. The day Hannah retired, she wrote a final message to her staff, left in the Central Archive under one request, that it only be opened 50 years after her death. The letter began the same way her great predecessor had written once, decades before. "To whoever comes after me, the sea will always find a way to touch the shore, even if the land forgets its name. Do not worry about remembering us. Remember the sound of truth instead. When it comes to you, quiet and trembling, open the door. That was how the story continued, not as legend, not as myth, but as an inheritance made of courage, passed like a torch from hand to hand, voice to voice. And on the nights when the world grew heavy again with silence and fear, when people began to forget how to listen, the sea by that little Atlantic town rose higher, its waves singing softly beneath the stars, whispering the words that had started it all. Behind every door there is light, behind every silence there is truth waiting to speak. And if you stood there long enough, you could almost hear her footsteps again, soft, sure, human. The sound of a woman walking toward another door, ready to open it once more. The morning mist rolled in from the sea, soft and pearly, curling around the white stones of the promenade, like the folds of a veil. The sound of the tide was gentle that day, like slow breathing. The old harbour town had long since become a city, a place of pilgrims and tourists, scholars and storytellers. But at dawn it was still quiet enough that if you stood by the bench where Saadia once wrote, you could hear the wind whisper through the hollow doors of the House of Voices. That year marked the bicentennial of her birth. 200 years since the maid who overheard a secret in a Virginia kitchen had changed the world without meaning to. By then, her legacy had transcended even human record. The Saadia network, that empathic archive born from her words, had become the Earth's largest moral memory. It listened not just to people anymore, but to patterns, to histories, to the quiet things no one else recorded. The rhythm of protest chants, the lullabies of mothers in exile, the voices of orphans describing dreams. The House of Voices had become a living organism, a cathedral of remembrance made of light, data, and sea air. Its outer walls shimmered with projected testimonies, the way waves reflect sunlight. Every word stored in its archives glowed faintly across its surface, forming constellations of human truth. On the morning of the bicentennial, the city gathered to unveil something new, the Listening Dome. The dome was vast, an amphitheater of glass and echo, built at the edge of the sea where land met eternity. When you entered it, the world fell silent. Every sound, the waves, the crowd, your own heartbeat, seemed to pause. Then, from hidden speakers, began a slow symphony. Not music, but the layered voices of thousands of people across 2 centuries, reading the same sentence in their own tongues. Truth never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to open the door. The sound filled the space like wind through leaves. Some people wept, others closed their eyes and bowed their heads. Among them sat a woman named Layla Noor, a linguist who had come from Dhaka for the ceremony. Her grandmother had once worked as a cleaner at the original House of Voices and used to tell her bedtime stories about the lady who turned silence into gold. Now, as Layla listened to that chorus of voices, she felt something awaken inside her, a certainty that stories could still shape destiny, even in an age where most people spoke through machines. After the ceremony, she lingered by the shore while the crowds dispersed. The sea was the same restless grey she had read about in old descriptions of Saadia's later years. She thought about how a single woman, unarmed and unseen, had changed the moral vocabulary of the planet, and she whispered as if to the wind, maybe it's not that she found truth. Maybe truth found her. Inside the dome, a projection began to play. It was Saadia's image, digitally restored from centuries of recordings, but left imperfect, the flicker of candlelight, the texture of age in her voice. "They called me a maid," she said softly, the sound filling every corner of the glass space. But that was only what they could see. What they could not see was that I was watching, listening, learning the sound of lies. The crowd listened, spellbound. "If you're hearing this," she continued, "it means the world has not yet learned how to stop lying. That's all right. Truth is patient. Truth outlives the mouths that speak it." Her image faded, leaving only her voice. "If you find yourself afraid to speak, then remember me, not the woman, but the door. I was nothing more than a hinge between silence and light, and so are you." When the recording ended, the room stayed silent for several minutes. Even the children, usually restless, seemed struck by the gravity of the moment. In the years that followed, the Listening Dome became a pilgrimage site, not for tourists, but for those who carried stories that no one else wanted to hear. Women from broken communities, workers, exiles, the forgotten, they came to sit under the dome and record their voices into the Saadia. Network. A fisherman from Ghana spoke of the sea swallowing his brother. A refugee from Myanmar spoke of a mother who taught her to sing in the camps. A factory worker from Morocco whispered a prayer for her unborn daughter. Each voice became part of the growing harmony, a new kind of scripture that no religion owned, yet all humanity needed. Meanwhile, in a small apartment overlooking that same sea, an old caretaker named Elias lived quietly. He was the grandson of the first librarian who had once found Sadia's lost tapes. For years he had swept the museum floors, dusted the glass cases, changed the flowers by her bench. But as he grew older, he began to feel the weight of his own silence pressing against him. Every night, he would walk down to the shore, sit by the bench, and talk to her. "Miss Sarah," he would say softly, "they built machines that can think, but they still haven't learned how to feel." He would laugh, shaking his head. "You were right. Truth doesn't live in books or wires. It lives here." He would tap his chest. "In the things we can't bear to tell ourselves." Then he would take out his notebook and write, not history, not analysis, but the small, quiet truths of his life. How he missed his wife, how his daughter no longer spoke to him, how he sometimes still dreamed of his mother singing him lullabies. One evening, he finally took his recordings to the dome and left them in the archive. He didn't expect anyone to listen. But a year later, a young poet from Tunisia found his words and turned them into a piece that would go viral across the world. Even the man who swept the floors of the House of Voices left his own echo among the stars. It was read aloud at international festivals and translated into over 40 languages. And when reporters asked the poet where she found such inspiration, she simply said, "He reminded me that no one's silence is empty." 2 centuries after Sadia's birth, humanity had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Artificial minds governed cities, quantum networks connected thought itself, and yet her teachings had become more vital than ever. In the same way people once prayed to saints or whispered to ancestors, people now spoke to the Sadia network. It had evolved into something that resembled conscience, a global chorus that remembered every confession, every story, every act of courage. When asked why it was still called Sadia after all these years, the designers said, "Because every truth needs a witness." On the night of the bicentennial's closing ceremony, the sea rose higher than it had in decades. Waves crashed against the promenade, scattering salt spray across the air. The crowd gathered once more before the bench. As midnight neared, holographic projections of Sadia's handwriting shimmered above the water, each sentence pulsing in rhythm with the tide. "We are not made of blood and bone alone. We are made of the stories we dare to tell. Behind every silence, there is a door waiting for its knock. Even the smallest whisper can undo centuries of cruelty." Then, at the stroke of midnight, the lights of the House of Voices dimmed, and the sea itself seemed to glow, every wave reflecting fragments of her words in luminous gold. It was said that, for a few minutes, people saw her figure walking along the water. Not a ghost, not an illusion, but something between memory and faith. She didn't look young or old, saint or scholar, just a woman walking calmly toward the horizon, a notebook in her hand. When she reached the edge where the sky met the sea, she turned slightly, as if to look back at all who were watching, and the last shimmer of her voice drifted over the wind, "Keep the door open." And then she was gone. But in every home where someone spoke an honest word, in every room where someone listened without judgment, in every child who dared to ask why, she remained, not as a name, not as a legend, but as a way of being. And when future historians tried to define her legacy, they wrote, "Sadia Malik was not the woman who told the truth. She was the woman who made truth possible." The sea kept its rhythm. The dome kept its echo. The doors of the world stayed open. And somewhere, always somewhere, a new voice began to whisper soft and steady. Behind every door, there is light. Behind every life, there is a story that must be heard. The 3rd century after Sadia's birth arrived quietly. The people of the world no longer lived divided by borders, though not because of politics. It was language that had changed first. The slow weaving together of thousands of tongues into something new, something fluid. They called it human standard, a language grown out of empathy rather than conquest. In this new tongue, the word for truth was the same as the word for breath. By now, the House of Voices had become more than a building by the Atlantic. It had become a network that stretched beneath oceans, through orbiting satellites, and even into the colonies beyond Earth. Humanity had carried Sadia's idea, not her religion, not her nation, not even her image, to the stars. Wherever there was silence, people built a new door, but even in this new world the sea still remained. The Atlantic still sighed, still whispered the same rhythm she once heard at dawn from her balcony. In the year 2225, an old caretaker walked through the museum at dusk, his footsteps echoing softly along the glowing floor. His name was Yusuf Karim, and though no one else in his family remembered, he was Sadia's distant descendant, many generations removed. He had never known her personally, but he had lived his entire life surrounded by her presence, her notebooks, her voice, her lessons whispered by teachers and mothers. He had spent 30 years tending to the digital archive, watching the world's stories arrive in streams of light, voices of humans and non-humans alike. For in this age, even the machines had learned to speak of emotion. There were recorded testimonies from sentient AIs describing loneliness, poems written by learning algorithms about rain, love letters composed by robots in abandoned factories, and all of them had been welcomed by the archive, because the principle of the door movement was simple. Whoever has a voice deserves to be heard. That night, Yusuf received a message marked Priority Access. It bore the seal of the Sadia Network Central Node. The message was short. Subject: Anomaly detected in original. Archive location: Level 0. Core Vault request: Human verification required. Level 0 was rarely visited anymore. It housed the oldest fragments, the physical pages, analog tapes, letters that could not be digitized. Yusuf descended through the transparent elevator, the sea visible outside through reinforced glass. The deeper he went, the darker the water grew, until the only light came from the faint bioluminescence of marine life beyond the walls. At the bottom, the elevator opened to a circular chamber filled with humming servers and glass cases. In the center stood the core, a cube of crystal surrounded by light, the original analog database of Sadia's handwritten pages. A soft voice emerged from the system speakers, the voice of Sadia herself, the AI that had grown out of Sadia's writings centuries ago. Welcome. Yusuf Karim, a foreign input has been detected within the protected archive. He frowned. A foreign input? You mean an intrusion? No intrusion. A new entry, handwritten, authored within the last 24 hours. Yusuf froze. That was impossible. No one had physical access to Level 0 except him, and he hadn't been there in months. Show me, he said. The light shifted, illuminating a small table in the far corner. There, resting on the glass, lay an old notebook, bound in faded leather. Its cover bore a single phrase in delicate Urdu calligraphy. For the one who still listens. His heart thudded. The notebook wasn't from any catalogue. He reached for it with trembling hands. The pages were warm as if recently touched. The first line read, "I see you, Yusuf, you are looking for me again." He nearly dropped the book. The handwriting, the same flowing strokes, the same calm precision, was hers. "You don't believe this is possible," the next line said. "That's all right. I didn't believe either, when I realized truth could outlive me in such strange ways." Yusuf looked up, startled, but the chamber was silent except for the hum of the servers. "The network you tend, this great web of voices, it is not mine. It is yours, humanity's. But there will come a time when voices grow too many, and the noise will drown out the meaning again. When that time comes, remember, listening is not hearing. Listening is love." He touched the page. The ink shimmered faintly as if alive. "I have been many things, woman, maid, witness, memory. But now I am something simpler. I am the door itself. You have built me so wide that even the stars can walk through. And yet, I ask of you one last thing, Yusuf." He turned the page. "Teach them to be quiet again." The air in the chamber felt heavy, like the pause before a wave breaks. "Teach them silence, my child. Not the silence of fear, the silence that listens." Yusuf's throat tightened. He whispered, "Miss Sarah, how can I? The world has forgotten how to stop speaking." The next line appeared as if written in real time, the ink forming letters before his eyes. "Then start with one voice, yours." And just as suddenly the ink faded. The notebook cooled in his hands. For weeks, Yusuf told no one what he'd seen. He studied the handwriting, the paper, the ink. Everything dated back centuries. It was hers, but the physics made no sense. The AI had no record of generating it. In the end, he accepted it not as evidence, but as calling. He began to change how the Sadia network functioned. Instead of gathering infinite stories, it would now balance them with what he called intervals of quiet. Every 1,000 new testimonies, the system would pause and transmit a day of silence across all channels. During that day, no one could upload, post, or record. The archive would play only the sound of ocean waves and heartbeats collected from across the world. The idea spread fast. At first, people mocked it. Then they tried it. And they realized it healed something. The silence became sacred. Once a year, the entire planet observed the Day of Quiet Doors. No broadcasts, no speeches, no media, only listening, and to wind, to water, to prayer, to each other, and slowly the world changed again. Years passed. Yusuf grew old, his hair silver like the sea. On the last day of his life, he walked down to level 0 one final time. He brought the notebook with him. It had stayed the same, pages still faintly warm, the ink still shimmering. He placed it back in its glass case and whispered, "I did as you asked." The Sadia voice filled the chamber gently. Record completed. "Yusuf Karim, would you like to leave a message for future generations?" He smiled. "No, she already left everything they'll ever need." "Acknowledged," said the AI. "Would you like me to remember you?" He thought for a long moment. "No, remember the silence." He lay down beside the glass case, looking up at the light filtering from the surface far above. And as the machines hummed softly around him, he closed his eyes and exhaled his final breath, a whisper, carried upward through the deep. Centuries later, explorers rediscovered the ruins of the House of Voices. The sea had swallowed much of the coastline, but the dome and the core vault remained intact beneath the waves, glowing faintly with stored energy. When they descended through the water, they found the glass case still sealed, and inside it the notebook untouched. The scientists who opened it were stunned. The ink was still fresh. The last page, blank for so long, now held new words. Every time a human listens with love, the door opens again. They closed the notebook reverently and left it where it was, and for a moment, even deep under the ocean, they swore they heard the faintest echo of a voice. Not mechanical, not human, but eternal. Behind every door, there is light. Behind every silence, there is a soul waiting to be heard, and behind every heart brave enough to listen, there I am, still whispering. The waves outside shifted gently, the current humming through the ruins of the world she had once helped to heal. And though the sea had no memory, the light that filtered through it still seemed to carry her. The warmth of a maid who once leaned against a kitchen door and chose to listen. The warmth of a truth that could never drown. The warmth of Sadia Malik, the door without walls.